The Broken Doll. Credit, Aradian Knights. When Mikasa Ackerman is kidnapped, she is not saved by Eren Jaeger. Instead, a thug from Wall Sina named Levi takes her under his wing. Chapter 1. A Great Grief. A Great Grief. What the hell did you do to her? He asked, bending before the young girl. She was small and skinny, her eyes glassy and dark and empty. They were fixed on Levi's face, and it made his stomach turn to look at them. They had brought him a corpse. A living fucking corpse. Typical. Mikasa Ackerman was pretty. For a child. She had a round face, feathery black hair, and a slender body. However, there were mauve and sallow bruises crawling delicately across her dainty features, blood crusted on her cheeks, on her gaping, swollen lips, around her blackened eyelid, smeared across her forehead and the front of her dress. Her left arm looked awkward, bent at an angle that suggested it had been broken days ago. The largest man spoke up. Levi didn't care for his name. He didn't care for any of them. They were a disappointment, and he was disgusted with every detail of this dealing. She fought, the man said gruffly, shrugging. It's not our foul. Levi's boot crashed into his jaw, sending him flying into the opposite wall. Levi looked at him, staring coldly as the man clutched at the side of his face that had rather painfully crunched against the solid concrete. Idiots, Levi thought as another one dove at him. With a flick of his wrist, a blade was in Levi's grasp, and the man's throat was opened like rain being expelled from the heavens. Only much messier. The blood went flying, coagulating for a short moment before bursting and splattering across the floor, flecks of it catching the poor beaten girl in the face. She had no reaction to this horror. She merely laid on the ground like a broken doll. That's all she is, Levi thought, watching her without pity. A doll to be used in all different perverse ways. And I thought I couldn't go any lower. He might have laughed at it all, but in all honesty, he couldn't tell who was more pathetic. The broken child or the man who was going to sell her. In truth, he had thought that he had been dealing with someone older. But if all was true, the mother had died defending the girl. The mother was all they needed, Levi thought, stepping on the corpse of the man he had just murdered to reach to one he had punted into a wall. His ribs gave a sweet-sounding crunch as they collapsed beneath the weight of his soles digging into his back. They could have left the damn girl, and then maybe I wouldn't have cared at all what happened to the bitch. Levi was surprised at himself. He had not realized he'd had so much humanity left inside of him to be so disgusted with himself and the entire dealing. Not your fault. Levi flicked the blood off his blade, peering at it with a bored expression. That might be true. I don't really know. Or care. Levi saw the other one squirming. The one who was standing still, staring at Levi in shock and fear and awe. The man whose face was half collapsed reached for something. Levi stomped his boot onto the man's hand, successfully giving each and every twitching bone a good cracking. He tilted his head back at the unscathed man, and he twisted his foot as if squashing an insect beneath his boot. The man howled, and the sound bounced off the corridor of the underground tunnel where these types of dealings tended to take place. Tell me, Levi said, examining the blood caking his blade. His hand was smeared red. That bothered him. Who broke her arm? The uninjured man opened his mouth, but all that came out was a faint choking noise. Levi's jaw set in irritation, and he closed his eyes. Why did he deal with these people? Why was he even here? Why did it have to be a goddamn child? Fine, Levi said. Whatever. He sliced the throat of the howling man with one stroke, cutting deep and precise. He watched the blood as it tumbled in a strange sort of cascade, dribbling at first and then gushing, blooming red and bursting out and out in a flow. Levi drove his face down into the dirt with the heel of his boot, eyes narrowed in disgust. The man gurgled as he died. Part of him wished he had made the death more painful. The uninjured one went running. Levi's nostrils flared in rage. He pushed himself forward, kicking up a great deal of dirt as he leapt, his body moving fast and hard, streaking across the air and catching the man with ease. His one slender arm hooked around the man's neck as Levi pushed off, latching himself onto the back of the dealer. He leaned very close, his red blade glinting in the light and light. "Get off!" the man shrieked, squirming and twist, his arms batting at Levi's body. "Get dash!" "Stop screeching, swine," Levi said, his knife slipping inside the man's mouth, the blade pressing to his tongue. "It's unflattering." His screeching as the blade punctured the roof of his mouth was almost unbearable. Levi listened to his teeth crack, the noise somehow more haunting than the agonized screams. He yanked the blade out and gave the man's throat a good slit for good measure. His screeching turned to choking, bloody mouth yawning open and moving with the sound of wet gasps, gurgling, and then he slumped forward. The blood pooled in the dirt, sinking into it and turning a rich vermilion here, then a colorless black. Levi stood for a moment in the silence. His heart was ramming in his chest. Whatever done? He thought as he looked around numbly. Bodies littered the ground, gooey flesh strewn across the wall, streaks of blood, pools congealing against the tightly packed dirt. The lantern flickered. The corpses called. "What a mess," Levi murmured, staring at his bloody hands. He cocked his head back at Mikasa Ackerman, the dead doll. He stared at her little body, which had not budged since the dealers had thrown her down at his feet only 10 minutes previous. He walked cautiously toward her and he saw something. In her hollow black eyes, something sparked. Fear. Levi stopped. He looked down at himself, all unkempt clothing and splattered blood. In truth, they didn't look much different. Only she was a broken child and he was a broken man. He scowled a little at the thought of it. But still, he was at a bit of a loss. What now? What could he possibly do with a child who had been brought to him to sell for a pretty face? He wiped his blade on a handkerchief he produced from his pocket. Her suddenly very alert eyes were following his every movement. He gave a sniff and examining his blade pensively. "Those bastards," Levi told her idly. "They stained my shirt. And your dress." Mikasa Ackerman looked at him and her busted lips parted wider in terror. He stared at her for a moment and sheathed his knife without thought. "Can you speak?" he asked her. She stared at him as if he was a titan come to gobble her up. That made him want to smack her, but he had no taste for harming the girl. He rubbed his hands against the handkerchief. "You better be worth it," Levi warned the child with a low voice. "You're worth a lot of money, you know." Her lips trembled. He rolled his eyes. "Stand up," he barked. She began to shake. He resisted the urge to throttle her. "Stand up," he repeated in a low voice. "Or you can stay here with these corpses. I don't care, honestly, but you need to decide." "No." Her trembling was distracting. He couldn't think with all her quaking, and he needed to think. He needed to think fast. What the hell was he going to do with her? "I need to hide her," he thought. Hide her where? With me. It sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. "Mikasa," Levi said. "Move your ass or die. Those are your choices." If she shook anymore, she might have snapped in half. Like a branch in the roar of a storm, she looked even more broken than when she began. But somehow, she sat herself upright. And she looked like she was about to start sobbing, tears welling up inside her dark eyes. "Good," Levi said softly. He offered out his hand. Tentatively, with quaking fingers, she grasped it. Levi couldn't help the relief that stretched through him. And then he remembered he had no idea what to do with her, and he sighed. He yanked her roughly to her feet, watching her legs wobble as she swayed uneasily. She gained balance, but she was still trembling. "Walk with me." She did. One foot after the other, her feet scraped across the ground mechanically. After a little while, her shaking stopped. Her mouth opened and closed, gaping and breathing heavily. "Who?" she finally whispered. Her fingernails dug into the flesh of his palm, scraping at the drying blood. He stared ahead, and he debated for a moment. "Levi," he told her, leading her forward into the darkness. She said nothing for a very long time. They walked, their feet making the softest of noises against the emptiness of the tunnel. "Thank you, Levi," she said softly. Her voice echoed in the darkness. It was a dead whisper. Levi paused for a moment and looked down at her with a hard gaze. "Don't," he said simply. Chapter 2. The Drop of Water. "You're filthy," Levi stated, gritting his teeth as the girl shrunk back from him. She was staring at the bathtub as if it was the yawning mouth of a titan, jaw slack and teeth polished frighteningly white. Mikasa Ackerman had the eyes of a corpse as she gazed ahead, standing stolidly in the doorway as if stepping into the washroom would cause the floor to collapse beneath her. She was gripping her tattered, soiled dress with white knuckles. "Stop gawking. I'm not going to hurt you, I'm just going to give you a bath. Unless you can bathe yourself." Mikasa opened her mouth, her puffy lips parting for a moment as she stared up at him. For a moment she stood with her body as still as stone. She gingerly touched her broken arm and closed her mouth without a sound. She closed her eyes and gave her head a little jerk, a shake that told him no. No, she could not bathe herself. "Do you have any living family?" Levi asked as he knelt beside the tub, letting it steadily fill up with water. It wasn't exactly warm water, but it ran from the old, beaten faucet in a clear flow, and that was really all he could be thankful for. She said nothing. When he paused to look back at her, she was standing in the doorway, stock still and staring with her dead black eyes fixed on his back. Her knuckles were wide against her arm. She pressed her lips together thinly, and the silence pulled around them, pattering softly with only the rhythm of the bathtub filling as their backdrop. Levi stood, flicking off the faucet. "I see," he said. She looked at him, and it was as if her eyes saw a translucent man. "That's unfortunate. Now I actually have to keep you around." Mikasa glanced away, her chin tucking to her chest as she let her hair curl around her face. Perhaps she was ashamed. He couldn't fathom why, but her hunched appearance gave off the feeling of uncertainty. "Do what I say," Levi demanded, "and there won't be any issues. You can stay here, you can leave. It's your choice, and I honestly couldn't care less, but for right now this is my home. So your skinny ass is getting a bath before you track and lice." Mikasa stood in the doorway, her eyes growing wide as he stepped toward her. For a moment Levi thought she would run, but as her body grew taut, she seemed to resign herself. "Oh," she said. And that was the last thing to leave her mouth for the rest of the evening. He had to help her out of her ruined dress, and he could sense that her broken arm was giving her a great deal of pain. She favored her right side, but she gave no inkling of pain. Until he looked into her dead black eyes, and he saw tears swelling within them. It made them look swatty and sad. He scrubbed at her back with soap, watching as she sunk her body into the sudsy water. Her knees were hugged to her chest, and her hair was hanging limply around her shoulders in twisted, inky strands. He didn't think that making conversation would be appropriate, nor did he care to upset the silence as he worked at cleaning the dirt and blood from the tiny girl. In the end he counted 27 bruises, 9 minor cuts, 2 half-healed gashes, and 1 broken bone. He was careful not to harm her throughout the bathing process, and he also took great care not to actually touch her skin to skin. When he did touch her, he often just pressed a cloth between his palm and her flesh. She was uncomfortable enough, and after what she had just been through, he was aware of how everything he did was leaving a horrible stain on her perception of him. However, that didn't stop him from bathing her. Because like fuck he was letting her sit around with speckles of blood marring her face. "Here," Levi said, handing her the bar of soap. She took it in her uninjured hand and gave a soft gasp as it slipped through her skinny fingers when she closed her fist around it. The bath flew into the air and plopped into the water with a small splash, spitting up a few bubbles and murky droplets. The grime from Mikasa's body had turned the water a hazy color, like the hue of cold tea. She stared for a moment at the water, her swollen lips parting. Her dark eyes darted up to his face in terror. "What?" Levi asked. He studied her face for a moment and exhaled sharply through his nose. "I'm not going to yell at you, stupid girl. Just get the bar." She looked down, her eyes widening for a short moment as she reached with her uninjured arm and felt around the bottom of the tub. Levi watched her without interest, and he carefully pushed back her damp black hair. The back of her neck had some dirt clinging to it, and some dried blood flaking against her protruding bones. When she finally got the soap after minutes of fumbling with the slippery thing, she offered it back up to him with hunched shoulders and a bowed head. "I gave it to you, didn't I?" Levi had to remind himself not to get angry at the girl. "You have one good arm. Put it to use." She stiffened as if he had slapped her. He dipped his cloth into the water as she stared down at the soap and cautiously scrubbed at the scum caked to her skin. After a few moments of doing so, she followed the suit and began to rub the soap against her knee. With her help, he was able to get her clean much faster. And he was strangely content with this accomplishment. There was a sense of peace as he motioned her to stand, and he draped a downy towel around her emaciated body. The water swished and spat in objection as he scooped her from its grasp and plopped her down on the dull wooden floor. He tightened the towel around her so that all he could see of her were her bony legs, shuffling feet, and the top half of her head. Her dark eyes peeked out from behind the scraggly curtain of damp black hair, and they watched Levi with something else. Something alive and awed sparked behind the murky gaze. She stared at his back acutely as he turned to pull the plug on the tub drain. For a moment he stood watching the brown-tinted water gush and rush, swirling around and around as the drain sapped at it hungrily, slurping the dirty contents of the tub into oblivion. Through the sounds of the drain gulping, he had the urge to speak to the girl. The words were soft on his tongue, and they sat heavily in mouth. "See," he almost said. "That wasn't so bad." He swallowed the words like a mouthful of salt, and said instead, "Wait here." She watched him leave the room without comment. In fact, she merely buried her lips deeper into the fluffy fabric of the towel, allowing her body to be swallowed by the feathery material. He walked to his room without much thought, moving straight to his wardrobe and swinging it open. His lone window was shuttered, but he could hear the soft patter of rain from outside. He stood for a moment, his fingers curling around the wooden doors of his wardrobe, and he stared ahead at nothing. "What the hell am I doing?" he wondered. He lived in a small house on the eastern side of Yolko. He had 3 rooms, the bathroom, his bedroom, and the living room with a kitchenette. Each room was rather small and cramped, featuring only what was needed. And he had no idea how to deal with a child, let alone provide for one. Levi wasn't exactly impoverished, he knew very well how to make money fast. But children needed more nourishment than he could give. He'd observed families from afar, and he had his own hazy memories to add to it. Children were needy creatures, desperate and whiny and clingy. Food was not their main concern, though by all means it should be. Children needed comfort and stability, and worst of all they needed love. Compassion, or some contrived bullshit like that. And Levi was the absolute worst person to tend to a child's needs. He gathered up a pair of slacks and a shirt, sifting through his clothing to try and find undergarments that might fit the scrawny girl. Once he did, he slammed the wardrobe shut and spun on his heel. He knew there was no way he could hide Mikasa. Perhaps if her features were not so distinct he could have sheared her hair and passed her off as an errand boy to lead his employers off a trail, but it was impossible. He would have to face them sooner or later, and either they would take her from him, or he would have her permanently in his grasp. Both scenarios left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Here." Levi set down the clothing on the floor, and he stood up straight to look down at Mikasa. She had not budged since he had left the room, and there was a small puddle of water pooling on the floor beneath her. She stared at the clothes for a few moments, her stare blank and inscrutable. "I'm not helping you put them on. You can still function with one arm, so you will do this by yourself. Come to me when you're done." He left her there, standing in shock with the fluffy towel wrapped tightly around her slightly trembling body. He was distracted by his own thoughts, so he didn't dwell on it. Could he sell her? He wasn't sure if he had the heart for it. And so he weighed his options and found that he had no choice but to keep her. Or at the very least shelter her until he found some other option. He would meet with his employers when they called upon him and admit to his indiscretions. Let them try and take her from me, Levi thought, setting the first aid kit down on his living room table. He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees and pressing his folded hands to his lips as he lost himself in thought. We'll see just how weak the peaks truly are. It took Mikasa around 10 minutes to dress herself. She appeared in the doorway with her damp black hair swirling across the collar of his white button-down, leaving wet grey patches around her shoulders. The slacks were black and a tad too long, pulling around her ankles while the waistline hung precariously low. Still, they seemed to fit enough that they stayed up, and that was good enough for him. She was holding her soiled dress tightly, hugging it to her chest with her head bowed low. "Give me that," Levi said, standing and moving toward her. She let him snatch it without comment, and he noticed that she had only buttoned 3 buttons of the shirt. Of course, she had done it one-handed, so he couldn't be too bothered by it. Levi looked at the crumpled white dress, stained from blood and dirt amongst other foulness. His nose wrinkled slightly, and he turned away from the girl, tossing the dress into the garbage bin. She visibly jolted at that, but she bowed her head so he couldn't see her expression. He felt momentarily guilty for it, but the sting passed quickly. "I'll buy you another one." She gave no hint that she cared beyond that point. So he motioned her toward the couch, carefully tending to her arm. He made her a makeshift splint and then set her arm into a sling. He didn't know how long it would take to heal, but he figured at the very least he could save her some time and pain. She was very quiet and very still, as if she had turned to stone as she Saturday. When he was done with her arm, he tended to her face. Head up. She did exactly what she was told. It made him wonder if she was so compliant to the men who had kidnapped her. If so, he found himself enraged that they had heard her. But he kept himself as calm as he could, bandaging the cuts on the girl's face and pulling back for a few moments to peer at her. He said nothing as he stood up, moving to the stove. He could feel her staring as he prepared his kettle. He set up 2 cups, busying himself to keep his mind off how complicated he had just made things for himself. It was definitely possible that his reputation would be a little sullied after this incident. Who would want to deal with a man who might kill them and steal their goods? Yes, there was a fair chance he had royally fucked up his own operations. But he had to tell himself it was worth it to protect the girl. Besides, she was so quiet, it was as if she wasn't even there. "Here," Levi said, setting a cup of tea on the table before the girl. He took to sitting cross-legged on the floor, picking up his cup with his hand all but covering the top of it and taking a sip. It burnt his tongue, but he ignored the sting and instead focused on Mikasa's face. She was studying him with fright in her face. "She doesn't know if she trusts me," Levi thought, setting his cup down. "Not as stupid as I thought, ha, girl." "It's not poisoned," Levi said, staring at her. "Go on. Drink up, girl." She quickly snatched the cup as if he'd struck her back, her arm stretching out and grasping the handle. He noticed how her skinny wrist shook as she brought the cup to her lips, taking a tentative sip. She pulled back immediately, her eyes snapping closed for a few moments. Her hand began to shake so badly that the tea sloshed, almost spilling into her lap. He swiftly snatched the cup from her. "Hold it like this," Levi said, holding up the cup in his crane-like grip. "It's easier." He wasn't sure if that was true. It was certainly easier for him, habit had formed him, and he held his cup the way he wished. For the girl, though, perhaps it wasn't. She didn't object there. She drank her tea in silence, mimicking his hold on the cup and watching him with swampy black eyes. He didn't know what to say. He was a little lost in how to talk to her. He saw no point in coddling her or speaking softly. She knew how volatile he could be, so there was no point to it. He drank his tea with his eyes never leaving hers. She's too quiet, Levi realized. Was he doing something wrong? Probably. He honestly never dealt with children when he didn't have to. "How old are you, Mikasa?" Levi asked, looking down into his empty teacup. She gave no reply. When he looked up at her again, he noticed her eyes were dripping. The warmth of the tea must have swayed her body. He sat in silence for a few moments, watching as she began to slump a little more. 10 minutes later, she was curled on his couch, shallow breaths indicating her slumber. He took great care to not wake her as he picked up her tiny body. Levi wouldn't use the word gentle to describe himself. As in, never ever would he fucking describe himself as gentle. So the best word he could use to describe the sequence of putting Mikasa Ackerman to bed would be awkward. He kicked his door open, blinking as the knob smacked against the wall. He froze at the jolting sound, but Mikasa did not awake, nor did she stir. It seemed exhaustion had crept up on her. He set her down on his bed as gingerly as he could and gritted his teeth when she almost rolled off. He tossed a blanket on top of her, taking a quick step back in apprehension. When she didn't wake up, he took a little more care in straightening the blanket out. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment with his back pressing to the wood. "Shit," he said, closing his eyes. He was well aware of how much trouble he had just heaped onto himself. Chapter 3. The Red Shoes. Her drains were brimming with blood. When she awoke, she could taste it on her tongue, acrid and burning intensely. She breathed in, her thoughts roving wildly, escaping into the mindless rush of drains, melting into a maelstrom of lilting screams. Mikasa. She heard the sound fluctuating and spinning, breaking apart and bursting into a wet, shaky sound. "Run. Hurry, Mikasa." There was something piercing about the voice. It clung to her like a vapor, a wisp singing in her ear, caressing her cheeks. She was lying on a bed. Her reaction was a bit delayed, but after a few moments of staring at her arm in a sling, she bolted up straight. A blanket crumpled into her lap, and she stared at it for a moment, her heart pounding hard in her chest. The room was small, nothing but a bed and a wardrobe and a small nightstand. Sunlight trickled in through the shuttered window, sending fragments of broken rays skittering across the wooden floor. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. After recalling Levi's impromptu rescue of her, she sat on the bed for a moment and stared. She simply had no idea what to do now. For weeks she'd been trying to escape the men who had kidnapped her, and eventually she had just stopped. She couldn't remember when. It had been a slow, agonizing process of completely obliterating her willpower. She pushed back the blanket, testing the softness of it with the tips of her fingers. The fabric was so downy it stung, swallowing up her fingertips in a tickle of fibers against calloused skin. She stared for a moment, her eyes going wide in confusion. She didn't know how to feel. Fear was toiling inside her stomach, but so was relief and awe and confusion. There was something inside her, a fist that clenched her gut and refused to let go. She was so lost, she couldn't possibly make sense of her situation. She found a dress sitting at the foot of the bed. It was red. It was red and pretty, laying out in a way that suggested there had been a great deal of care into flattening out any wrinkle. She touched it, ran her fingers across the airy fabric, giving the raised embroidery a good stroke before she sat back and blinked. There were flowers stitched into the collar, trailing down the front of the dress and spilling into a spattering across the skirt. She bit her lip, wincing in pain at the sensation of her teeth tearing into broken skin. "It looks too pretty," Mikasa thought, dropping her hand into her lap. "It can't be for me, can it?" And even if it was so, she didn't trust this kindness. She desperately wanted to, but there was a fear gnawing inside of her, and it refused to release her. After a few minutes of staring at the dress, she pushed herself from the bed, shuddering as her bare feet scraped across the wooden floor. She fumbled with the doorknob for a moment before it creaked open. She stared at it with wide eyes and tentatively peered out. There was no one immediately standing there. "I can run," she thought numbly. "Oh. I can run if I want. I can go home." The thought fueled her. It roared into awakening, a bursting spark that burned inside her heart and consumed her senses. She stepped out of the room, her feet moving mechanically across the floor. They were cracked and aching, but she ignored it all as she walked in utter silence across the room. Her eyes were on the front door. Her heart was drumming against her ribs relentlessly, taunting her and bursting with apprehension and longing. She could almost smell the grass and trees, feel the wind caress her skin. The wafting flowery smell of her mother's hair burnt her nose. Mikasa grasped the doorknob and it felt cold in her palm. Ice burning into her flesh, and she twisted it with wide eyes. Home, she thought dazedly. I can go home. The moment the door cracked open, a cold voice struck her spine. Where the hell are you going? She bit back a gasp, her eyes going big and horrified inside her skull. Her mouth was parted open as her knees wobbled pitifully. The doorknob jostled beneath her trembling fist. Her broken arm throbbed painfully, and her heartbeat was screeching at her, thundering and threatening to rip her apart from the inside. She imagined bones snapping, the image of her body crumpled on the floor with her chest bursting and her ribs yawning open. She stood in shock. Her lips trembled and tears welled in her eyes. Home, she thought desperately. I'm going home, and you can't stop me. Her hand gave a slight jerk. The wooden door clicked closed. She stood there for a minute before she turned around. He was standing with a bowl in his hands, and there was steam rising from its contents. Mikasa felt her stomach give an involuntary shudder, a great snarling moan drifting from it. She pressed her hand to it, pressing her lips together in spite of the pain. She looked down at the floor, at Levi's trousers that were pulling over her feet in a ripple of dark fabric. Are you staying? Levi asked. His expression remained the same. Mikasa was uncertain because his face never seemed to change. It was making her nervous. What's with that face? All I did was ask you a fucking question. Her eyes widened and she recoiled at his words. She heard him sigh, and when she looked up she saw him set down the bowl on the table. Here, he said. And that was all. She swallowed her fears and looked up at him in shock. The tears were drying in her eyes. She silently crept to the table, standing over the bowl and gaping a little. It was nothing but a bowl full of porridge, but it was more substantial than anything she'd eaten in weeks. She knelt down and took the spoon in her hand, scooping up a steaming spoonful of oats. She stared at it for a few moments, keenly aware of his scrutiny, and then she closed her mouth around it. It scorched her tongue enough to bring tears back into her eyes, but she swallowed it anyway as her stomach grumbled in satisfaction. If you don't like it, Levi said, his voice the usual low, level cadence, I have some bread and jam. She didn't hear the rest of his words because she was shoveling the porridge into her mouth so fast that it dribbled down her chin, burning the skin off the roof of her mouth and sending her into an odd sort of shock. She couldn't stop eating, and it was a little startling because she honestly hadn't realized how starving she was. Sure, she had been hungry and weak, but she hadn't noticed just how much so. Slow down, Levi commanded, snatching her wrist before she could swallow another bite. He wiped at her chin with a cloth, and she flashed with embarrassment. You're eating like a pig. Stop it. Oh, she mumbled softly as the cloth rubbed against her busted lips. Yes, Levi said, folding the cloth up and setting it aside. Oh. Did those pieces of scum feed you at all, Mikasa? She looked down at her bowl and shrugged. She pushed the oats around for a few moments and then began to eat again. This time she made sure to take small, slow portions. She didn't know what to say. She focused on eating and staring ahead of her vacantly. Levi continued to watch her with his slim eyes narrowing slightly. Minutes passed. She finished the porridge and picked up the bowl, rising to her feet and looking around the room. She spotted the sink and wasted no time in taking the bowl to it, running the water so it'd wash out the smear of oatmeal crusting on the bottom. Wash your hand, Levi said. She blinked for a moment and obliged without comment. When she was done, she turned back to Levi. He was studying her with a blank face, and she bowed her head, pressing her back to the sink. Do you not like the dress? She looked up at him sharply, her mouth falling open in shock. She gasped, her eyes snapping wide. Oh. That was mine. Yeah. He stared at her, and she sunk into herself. What? Did you think that thing was mine? No. Mikasa gasped, pressing her hand to her lips and shaking her head. I'm sorry. I thought. She didn't want to say it. She closed her eyes. Don't speak with your hand over your mouth, Levi sighed. Sorry. She dropped her arm. I thought you might, She blinked up at him. Have a Mrs. Levi, maybe. He gave her a very long, very vacant stare. No. She felt her cheeks burning, and she stared at him with a parted mouth. Oh, she said faintly. Levi shook his head. They stood for a few moments awkwardly, the silence spilling over them and slashing at their feet. Mikasa was still unsure of him. She wanted to be thankful, but he scared her. His eyes were cold and his face was hard and inscrutable, and she simply couldn't fathom him. He saved me, she thought. I shouldn't be scared of him. But she was. Get dressed, Levi said, spinning away from her. We are going out. Huh? Mikasa blurted. Out. He looked back at her, his eyes sharp. If you hate the dress that much, I'll buy you another one. But. Mikasa twisted the long sleeve of her shirt nervously. Wasn't that expensive? I have connections. What does that mean? She thought. I don't need another dress, Mikasa said quietly. Then go put it on. I have things to do, and you're putting yourself to good use, that is, if you're staying. She stood rigidly. Her eyes traveled to the door, and she stared at it with despair creeping inside of her. Home, she thought glumly. What home? The sinking realization that she had no home to return to choked her. She lurched toward the bedroom door, stumbling over the loose trousers, and she swung the door open. Her throat was constricting, and the tears had welled over, glistening on her cheeks. She froze for a moment, words catching in her throat. They stung sharply, puncturing her like glass as she swallowed them down. I'll do what I'm told, she thought, shutting the door behind her. She felt a little numb as she reached for the dress, her fingers fumbling at the fabric. Tears were drying on her cheeks. If I can't fake him, the least I can do is be as little a burden as possible. And so she struggled with the process of undressing herself. When she exited the room again, she was clutching the sling for her broken arm. She stood for a moment with her head bowed, feeling awkward as his cold eyes assessed her appearance. The red dress fit her fine, feeling light and flowing as it wavered around her calves. She looked up when she heard Levi step closer to her, and she found herself frozen in shock as he took the sling from her hand. He said nothing as he reapplied the sling, his fingers quick and meticulous, but careful all the same to not hurt her. She stared up at his face, searching it wildly for any sign of emotion. Some form of compassion. It was all she needed, truly, just some sign that her gut was wrong. That she shouldn't be scared of him. But his expression was impassive, and though she was thankful to him for everything, it was hard to grasp him. She couldn't link him to many adjectives, except for a few negative ones. Tell me if it's too tight, Levi said, his voice low as he stepped back from her. Mikasa pressed her fingers to the sling, the fabric cold to the touch. She shook her head fast. She tried to catch what the lowness of his voice signified. She knew it meant something. She could feel it graze her skin, the words gathering on her cheeks and melting slowly. She realized then that there was something positive about Levi. The low tone was not a lowering of the pitch of his voice. It was the lowering of the volume. He'd spoken softly to her. Soft. In a burst of childish curiosity, Mikasa reached out. The thing that compelled her was her own miserable mind and a strange twinge in her heart that begged for some relief. There was an itching inside her, an emotion she couldn't quell, and she gave into it. The moment her fingers brushed Levi's palm, she noticed his stature visibly changed. If only for half a moment, Mikasa could see Levi go rigid in shock. To Mikasa's bitter disappointment, Levi's hand was not soft at all. It was calloused and cold, bony and raw and scratchy. Her fingers were swallowed up by the closing palm, and she swallowed a squeak as his skin dug into hers. She could feel his eyes on her face, and it felt like a slap as she hung her head a little in shame. Her face felt warm from embarrassment. And then he dragged her forward. Come on, Levi said. Move fast. Stick by my side. If anyone who isn't me touches you, I want you to kick him in the balls and then scream. Got it? In truth, she had no idea what he meant by kick them in the balls, but she gave a phlegmatic, "Yes, Mr. Levi." He gave her a look. "Levi," he corrected. "Don't be fucking with my name, girl." "Sorry," Mikasa said, her voice quiet, "Levi." He gave a nod of what she could only assume was approval, and he dragged her forward again. Outside, the world was acrid. Humidity hit her hard, caking to her skin as she moved swiftly in time with Levi's steps. The air tasted distinctly of post-rain haze, and it left her lethargic and weighed down. The town she was in was bustling, which was unfamiliar to a girl who spent the majority of her life in the mountains. She found herself hanging close to Levi's side out of pure shock and unfamiliarity. She was startled and awed. The roads twisted like broken limbs, running into small alleys and alcoves. Shops lined the streets, painted wooden signs swinging against the subtle breeze. With every sharp turn, Mikasa found herself all but hugging Levi's side while trying to avoid bumping into passers-by. He gave no sign that he minded, but she forced herself to calm anyway. They entered a tavern on their fifth turn, a building of yellow and brown wood that stood large and rickety, like an old, rotting tree. The barmaid saw Levi, and her eyes widened. "Oh my," gasped the woman. She wasn't old by any means, but to Mikasa she looked ancient and colossal. She towered over Levi, and thus Mikasa was unbearably small in comparison. "You're early, aren't you?" "Something came up," Levi said. The woman's eyes fell on Mikasa, blue and searching. They moved to her hand in Levi's grasp, and in reaction they grew wide with alarm. "And who's this?" the woman asked, hiding her shock with a sweet smile. Mikasa knew better. "Mikasa Ackerman," Levi said. "Pretty name," the woman said, smiling gently at Mikasa. "How old are you, sweetheart?" Mikasa stood for a moment in silence. The question seemed to bounce off her. She stared at the woman for a moment before she drew her attention elsewhere. There was no one else in the tavern, which Mikasa thought a little peculiar. She looked up at Levi when she felt his eyes on her. He was giving her a look. She couldn't decipher what it meant, as it looked exactly the same as all his other looks. She turned back to the woman, and she gave her a long look. Mikasa waited until the woman's sweet expression faltered before she answered. 9, Mikasa said. The woman looked at her, her mouth parting a little. 9, she said. Well, that's a very good age. Stop coddling her, Shats, Levi said. She's not stupid. She can see right through you. The woman's eyes flashed. Oh, the woman asked. Her sharp blue eyes grew cold, and Mikasa couldn't find it in her to be shocked. Is that so? Okay, then, Mikasa, tell me what you see, if you're so smart. Mikasa stiffened, and she found herself clenching Levi's hand for support. He stared at Shats and tilted his head. Don't patronize her, either, he said. Bitch at me all you want, Shats. Just don't talk to Mikasa like she's inferior to you because she's a child. Whatever, Shats said, her eyes rolling. Is there something you needed? A meeting place, Levi said. He let go of Mikasa's hand, and after that it was left to linger sadly in midair. Cold and dripping, like a wilting flower, and it fell to her side limply. She twisted her red sleeve around her palm, clenching and unclenching the fabric nervously. Tonight, preferably with a crowd. Witnesses, Shet said. She leaned against the bar, rested her cheek against her fist. Her face was slim, sort of splotchy and freckled, with a pinched nose and beady eyes. Her hair fell limply at the nape of her neck in a black ponytail. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I'll see who I can scrounge up, but I can't promise much. I have a list, Levi said, retrieving a neatly folded, faded bit of parchment from his pocket. He set it down on the bar, his index finger resting at the paper's corner. He slid it across the surface of the counter to Shats, who watched with a suddenly bored expression. Mikasa decided she was scary too. Too many faces, Mikasa thought. Nothing she says or does seems real. At least with Levi there was a constant state of apathy that clung to his features. Shats whistled. Shit. She had unfolded the paper and smoothed out the creases across the countertop. Who are all these people? Just a few of the countless many bastards who owe me some debts. Levi shrugged. Mikasa stared at his back, a series of questions bubbling inside of her chest. You don't see anything wrong with that statement, do you? Shet studied Levi's face and then sighed when she got no response. Okay. I'll call on these folks, then. Tonight, you said. Yeah. He turned away from Shatz and he jerked his chin at Mikasa. A signal to follow. She moved quickly to his side, twisting her face to look back at the woman. She was busy studying the list and did not look up. She did, however, give a little wave. See you later, Levi. When they were back on the streets amongst the hustle and bustle of noon, Mikasa found herself clinging to Levi once more. She had a feeling of eyes watching her back, but when she turned her face around, she saw no one. The chattering of people trickling through the streets made her anxious, and she blinked up at everyone who passed her by. Who was that? Mikasa asked suddenly. Quietly. Her voice was barely audible above the din around them. Levi wasn't holding her hand anymore, but he kept her close enough that she felt secure. He looked down at her for a moment, his small eyes searching her face. She felt a little foolish to ask, but she was curious. She looked up at Levi with her eyes matching his. She felt dull and tired, but she kept walking in time with him anyway. She couldn't do anything else, could she? She was lost amongst her own hazy thoughts, and it worried her. Greta Shetz, Levi said in his bored voice. A nosy bitch. But she's trustworthy enough. He turned his face toward the road again. If you're ever in trouble and I'm not there, go to her. She doesn't hate me so much that she'd leave you to the streets. Why do you trust her? Mikasa asked. The words were pulling inside of her mouth, spilling from her lips in a cascade of awkward curiosity. She couldn't keep it to herself any longer, and the bubbling questions all seemed to pop at once, filling her with unease and confusion. Why do you want to know? Mikasa stared ahead of her, her shoulders slumping. Her left arm gave a shudder of pain, but she ignored it. She just seems like she knows you, Mikasa said quietly. She stopped for a moment and hung back as she stared at Levi. She watched his body jolt to a stop, and he looked back at her sharply. It seemed he hadn't expected her to halt. Did that upset him? She couldn't tell. His face was still the same as it always was. It didn't bother her as much now that she was used to it, though. What? Levi asked. When Mikasa didn't answer, he turned his body completely around, and he stood with his chin rising ever so slightly. He stared down his nose at her, and she could see his eyebrows knitting together. What the hell is wrong now? You don't trust me, Mikasa said. Do you? That left him quiet for a few moments. Between their words, the sounds of laughter and feet clapping against stone filled the humid air. Clouds burst and tumbled overhead, knitting together and parting. Sunshine glimmered and faded for a short moment before rays smashed through the curtain of gray and white waves and filled the air with a singing gold glow. Why, Levi said stolidly, the hell would I trust you? Mikasa had no real answer for that. She stood with her body rigid, her bones feeling frozen inside of her muscles, and she stared at him with a dull gaze. She couldn't say she was surprised. She found herself twisting the sleeve of her dress again, and she could feel sweat pricking at the small of her back. Why did you save me? Mikasa asked in a quiet voice. I don't understand. Why help me? Why? Levi stared at her, and she stared back, the words drying up on her tongue. She hunched a little as it seemed to smack her how bold she was being. She didn't want him to cast her out. She had no home to go back to, and he was the only person in the world who she had to cling to. And Mikasa needed to know now. Did Levi truly care? He grabbed her by the right arm, and he yanked her forward. She gave a little gasp, her eyes flashing wide as he dragged her down the street. She couldn't speak, for her heart had jumped into her throat, and now she felt as if her lungs were constricting. The pressure was baffling, and she felt tears in her eyes, tears that had never quite disappeared. "What a stupid question," Levi said, his voice a soft sort of grumble. He squeezed her bicep and then shoved her into a narrow alley. Her back smacked against a stone wall, and Mikasa stared up at him with fear swallowing her up. He kept himself at as much distance as the skinny back road would allow, and she heard him inhale sharply through his nose. Was he angry? She couldn't tell. "Why did I save you? You really want to know?" "Yes," Mikasa said, her voice reedy and pleading. Levi pressed his back to the opposite wall, his eyes giving a strange sort of glint. He leaned with his legs outstretched, ankles crossed as he balanced on his heels. She watched him with widening eyes as he lifted his head, letting it loll a little to the side. She could see the corners of his lips twitching. It startled her into silence, and she shrunk against her own wall. The shadows of the alley bathed their features, turning them to small, hunched silhouettes. "Because you were pathetic," Levi said, his voice rising in a strange, brisk breath of air. "And because you don't deserve the fate those swine picked out for you." "What?" Mikasa looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. "What would you have done if you did think I deserved that fate?" He watched her for a few moments with his hollow blue eyes. She felt as though he could see right through her, read her very features, and extract the fearful thoughts beneath them. Levi had a stony face, but a soft one. His eyes were small and dull in the hollows of his head, perpetually tired and searching. His hair was dark, and it fell limply around his ears. For a minute he stared, his demeanor stunningly cold. "I would have sold you," Levi said. Mikasa closed her eyes. The words felt like a lash upon her back, but she had asked for it. "I wouldn't have thought twice about it. I've done it before. I've sold people, stolen from people, murdered people for petty reasons." His voice sounded dark, like there were cobwebs clinging to his throat. His words were soft. "And what does that say about me, Mikasa?" The words hung in the air loftily. They froze for a moment, stinging her heart like an icy kiss. And then they melted on her cheeks, hot and salty and wounding her like a backhand. That you're a bad person," Mikasa whispered, her lower lip trembling. She wiped at her cheeks quickly with her sleeve. "But I don't think you are." It was a revelation to her as well. She saw his eyes flash with something. And she thought, maybe, that he wasn't so apathetic after all. "Then you must be fucking stupid," Levi said, folding his arms across his chest. "Just because I saved one life, it doesn't make all the other shit I've done any less awful. You just believed in yourself, girl." "No," Mikasa said. "I'm not wrong." She felt certain. The weight of this certainty clung to her blissfully, and she wished it could make her feel better. "You're so sure of yourself," Levi said. His eyes narrowed. "When the fact is, you haven't even known me a day." "You saved me," Mikasa said quietly. "You're still saving me. That means you're good to me." She bowed her head, her hair sliding from her shoulders and framing her face in a soft flutter of black. "And I trust you." Her fear of him had melted away on the steady walk on soul-smooth stones. Mikasa was still stunned and confused and scared, but it was not Levi's fault. She was undeniably thankful to him for everything he had done for her, and his confession meant little to her now. She had already made up her mind. Home was gone now, lost amongst a pool of blood and a ricochet of a voice, soft and screeching in the barren landscapes of her memory. Levi's stare was different this time. She could hardly decipher it, but she was certain that it was different. She could feel it warm her chest as he held out his calloused, bony hand. She took it almost eagerly. Soft, she thought happily as they stepped back out into the street. His eyes are soft. Chapter 4. Thumbelina. Mikasa had tried to refuse the bed numerous times, but Levi would hear none of it. He squashed any sort of objections out of her and slept on the couch as if it meant nothing. She tried to compromise. Why not buy another bed? It would be cramped, but the bedroom could fit a small cot. When she'd suggested it, Levi had tilted his head to look at her, his small eyes glinting. You have the money for that? Levi asked in his dull tone. And where are you hiding it? Up your ass. Mikasa had gone silent from embarrassment, and for a little while it had seemed like Levi was rethinking his comment. He didn't say anything more on the topic, though, and Mikasa let it die with a heavy heart. I don't need this bed, she thought miserably at night. It's not mine, it's Levi's, and he should be sleeping here. I'd be happier on the couch anyway. She tried to make it up to him in different ways. She took extra care on the streets to memorize all the faces he told her to. That one there, Levi would said, his chin lifting in a slight gesture. Grey hair, brown shirt. Karl Herbst. Crooked bastard. Sold him a 16-year-old boy last year. I don't deal with him anymore, but maybe he was the one who wanted you. He sometimes talked about her kidnapping like that. Offhanded and nonchalant. Maybe he was the one who wanted you. As if that explained any of her unanswered questions. The only answers she had were broken fragments of words spat from the mouths of vile abductors. She didn't know what most of them meant, but she was certain it was horrible. A little left to you, Levi would say. A woman with blonde hair. Brown eyes, large lips. Rune cipher. She runs an underground brothel and is notorious for buying her workers from slavers and tradesmen. Usually Mikasa was quiet. She spared a glance to whomever Levi was referring to and mentally captured their appearance. But sometimes she'd respond in a voice so quiet, Levi often had to lean a little to hear her. These people, Mikasa said once. They are all suspects. He looked almost amused. Maybe he was. She couldn't quite tell. Haven't you caught on? Levi looked down at her and he gave a little sigh. No, I guess not. Yes, Mikasa. They are suspects. What will you do? Mikasa asked. When you find the person who wanted me. I'll do what I did to the people who brought you to me. Those words settled like a brick inside her stomach. Still, she couldn't complain. She liked Levi. He was callous and rude, but she could see the truth in him. It had taken a little while to place it, but she knew now that beneath the exterior, there was just a sad man who was entangled in a whole lot of bad. But she could sense the good in him. And she could sense his resolve too. She made it her goal to try and wake up earlier than him. It failed countless times, morning after morning, days passing in a blur. She crept out of her bedroom, her as always going straight to the couch. The case was this: Levi was either sitting there, sipping tea and reading, or he was at the stove preparing his tea with a book sitting on his folded blanket. She couldn't claim to be disappointed, but she was still a little bothered. One morning though, when she crept from her room, she froze in the doorway. Levi had come home rather late the night before, and as usual Mikasa had waited for him, sitting patiently on the couch as the hours ticked by. He didn't tell her the specifics of where he was going. Business, he had said. It could mean anything. It could mean a dealing. And Mikasa still wasn't sure what that entailed. Dealing. Even the word tasted foul. Mikasa must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, she was waking up in her bed. Levi had put her there, undoubtedly. But now he was a lump on the couch, face tucked into blanket. He was so still that for a moment Mikasa feared he might not be breathing. But when she crept closer, she could see the rising and falling of his chest. She looked down and smiled at her bare feet. Her toes whittled against the cold wood. After setting the kettle on the stove, she moved closer to Levi's slumbering form. She didn't want to disturb him. It was the first time she had ever seen him asleep. There was something jarring about it. Peaceful and sweet. A precious sort of moment that she could scarcely touch upon, it was so delicate. One false move and it was over. He'd be awake and the magic would be lost. She took the kettle off before it whistled and filled 2 cups with it. As she was creeping back to the couch, she saw Levi's body stir. She set her cup down on the table before she lost it and watched the man as he sat up in silence. The blanket slid to his shoulders as he supported himself with one arm, rubbing his eyes with the back of his wrist. He didn't seem to notice Mikasa until he blinked a few times, doubtless clearing the glaze of sleep from his eyes. He stared at her as she stood across from him, clutching a dish of tea. "Good morning," she said. She offered out the cup. "I made you tea. Why the hell are you awake?" The bluntness of his tone didn't faze her. She continued to hold out the dish. He sat up straight, his blanket crumpling in his lap as he took the dish from her. Mikasa didn't know how to defend herself. "I was up. I didn't see a reason to stay in bed." He took the cup in hand, sipping at the tea pensively. For a minute or so, she stood in absolute quiet. She could hear the soft drizzle of rain against the shutters and window pane. She could see a tear in Levi's sweater, a large and jagged tear that frayed the wool around it. Mikasa found herself staring at it blankly. "How long have you been awake?" Levi asked finally. "Not long," Mikasa said. She took her own tea, but did not drink it. She was too busy staring at him. Worry prickled inside her stomach. What happened? He was dirty, just generally caked with dust and maybe some blood. He'd taken his boots off by the door, but otherwise he was still wearing the clothes he must have stumbled through the front door in the night before. That was very unusual. She searched his face, but found no wounds to be accounted for. She found herself wiggling her left hand. It felt much better. There was nothing more than a ghost of an ache, and soon she felt she'd no longer need a bandage at all. "I'm going to take a bath," Levi said suddenly, setting his teacup down and standing up. Mikasa watched him disappear into the bathroom, and she shook her head. She went into the bedroom and withdrew a set of clothes for Levi to change into, not surprised that he hadn't gone to get them himself. She set them down at the foot of the bathroom door and then looked around the room. Keeping herself busy was an art she had mastered fast, and she soon had the entire room spotless. Not that there had been much to work with. Levi kept everything uncannily tidy. But she did fold up his blanket and close the cabinet and then set to work on breakfast. By the time Levi opened the door, his chest bare and a towel around his waist, Mikasa had finished making the porridge. Levi had almost stepped on the clothes, but at the last moment he seemed to notice them. For a few moments he stood there, water trickling from his damp hair to his chin. Then he looked to Mikasa. He scooped up the clothes and disappeared back into the bathroom. Mikasa set down the bowls across from each other and got 2 fresh cups of tea. Levi appeared behind her, drying his hair with a towel as he watched her. She turned to face him, standing with a new dish in her hands. His torn sweater was clenched in his fist. "I made breakfast," Mikasa said. "I have eyes." Mikasa could only shrug. She sat down on the floor with her legs crossed and she began to eat her oatmeal. It was a little too watery, but it tasted sweet from the pinch of sugar she drizzled over it. When Levi sat down across from her and he scooped a spoonful into his mouth, he paused. And he swallowed. "What did you do?" he asked, staring down at porridge. "I just mixed in a little sugar," Mikasa said softly, blinking down at her own bowl. Was that wrong? For a second, she thought he might shout at her. It would be the first time, and over something as insignificant as sugar on porridge. Then he gave a little shrug, scooping more into his spoon. "It tastes good," he said slowly, the words sounding awkward and quiet. "Genuine, though." Mikasa had to bow her head to hide a smile. "Thank you," she said. "Didn't I tell you not to thank me, little bitch?" When Levi had first called her that, she thought she'd done something wrong. But no. He'd meant it endearingly. It sounded too prickly to be affectionate, but he wasn't cursing her out either. Mikasa knew that it was just a matter of who Levi was. He liked the word bitch. She was fine with that. "Yes," Mikasa said. "I'm sorry." She took a tentative sip of her tea to further hide her smile. "Don't tell me you're sorry, either," Levi said, pointing his spoon at her accusingly. "Because I don't give a shit." "Oh." Levi stared at her for a few moments and then began to eat again. His eyes lowered to his food, and they continued to eat in complete silence. The drizzle of rain was steadily becoming a downpour. If that disconcerted Levi, he showed no sign of it. Mikasa knew he'd go about business as usual. He began to read about halfway through breakfast. It was the same book he always read. Does he have any other book? Mikasa wondered. She was too nervous to ask. While she was taking a sip of tea, Levi shoved the book under her nose and she nearly chirped. "Read this sentence for me," Levi said, his thumb pressing to the faded ink of a yellowing page. Mikasa clutched her teacup with white fingers as she stared at him, and she then set the cup down cautiously. She leaned closer to look at the words. They leapt off the page like black wires curling around her neck and crushing her throat. "There was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child, but she could not obtain her wish," Mikasa read. "At last she went to a fairy and said, 'I should so very much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I can find one?'" Mikasa paused, her brow furrowing a little. "What was this book?" "Oh, that can be easily managed," said the fairy. "Here is a barleycorn of a different kind to those which grow in the farmer's fields and which the chickens ate. Put it into a flower pot and see what will happen." Mikasa paused to look up at Levi. "What is this?" He took the book back and he shrugged. "A bunch of stupid stories," Levi said. Mikasa stared at him in wonder. "Why did you want me to read it?" she asked. "Is it important?" "No," Levi said, shutting the book and resting it beside his bowl. He looked at her, and his eyelids slid down in a strange scrutinizing motion. "I wanted to know if you were literate." Mikasa might have felt embarrassed or surprised, but in all honesty she couldn't find it in her. She was, however, a little offended. "My mother taught me," Mikasa informed him, her voice clipped and emotionless. "Why would you think I couldn't read?" Levi said in silence, his eyes resting on his face. They traveled down to the leather-bound book, beaten and second-hand, stained and peeling. He rested his hand on the cover, his fingers brushing the words pressed in heavy golden letters into the wrinkled skin. "When I was your age," Levi said, his voice quiet and low, "I couldn't." Mikasa sat, stunned, and she looked at the little book in wonder. "Oh," she said. Her cheeks grew warm, and she mentally chastised herself. You like to read, right, Levi?" He studied her face. "I don't reread this shit because I dislike it," Levi stated, frowning a little. "Is that the only book you have?" Mikasa folded her hands in her lap. When Levi nodded, she blinked in confusion. "Doesn't it get boring, rereading it?" "Not really." Mikasa stared at him, prodding him with her eyes to elaborate. He gave a lofty sigh. "I learned how to read with this dumbass book," he said slowly. "Don't get me wrong. I've read other books. But this one has stuck with me." "What happens?" Mikasa asked. "At the end." Levi gave her a look that she couldn't read. "There's too many endings," he said, sliding the book across the table and standing up. "Read them yourself." Mikasa stared at the book in wonder as Levi picked up his teacup and bowl, depositing it in the sink without a care. He rinsed them out as she mulled over his words, taking the book in her hands as if it was something cursed. It felt warm against her fingers, like the pages were made of flame and lamplight, glowing madly as it fought off the impenetrable dark. "I'll be gone for a few hours," Levi said, slipping a jacket on over his cotton shirt. He pulled up the hood, buttoning the tan coat with nimble fingers. "Don't get into any trouble." "I won't." Levi nodded. If Mikasa was to be honest, she couldn't deny the prickle of disappointment as he left without a word. It was a dull ache in her chest, the desire to be accepted. She imagined Levi patting her head and telling her, "You're a good girl, you know that." Of course, that would never happen. She wasn't so delusional as to think he'd ever be so affectionate. She read the book for an hour or so until it stopped raining. She got through numerous stories, strange old anecdotes about witches and magic and princes and beasts. It was not the sort of thing Mikasa had ever expected Levi to read. Some of the stories she had even heard before. The Little Mermaid, Mikasa thought. The Ugly Duckling. Some stories resonated stronger than others in her muddy memory. She decided on something as she flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes glued to the book. Levi forbade her from thanking him for anything. At least vocally. He made no objections to her efforts around the house or her success in delivering messages when he asked it of her. So perhaps he'd accept a gift. Mikasa thought it was a good plan. Perfect, really, and simple. She had passed by a bookshop a few times and it was only a block or so from Levi's home. The only problem was that she had no money. She went anyway. The walk was short and the sunshine glimmered against the glittering streets. Other children splashed through puddles happily, and all Mikasa could think was, I hope Levi doesn't notice the mud on my shoes. A boy even ran up to Mikasa, jumping before her and grinning broadly. Come play, he gasped, waving at her encouragingly. His companions were still laughing, jumping around puddles madly. Mikasa noticed how their socks had turned a damp, murky brown. We need another person to be a Titan. For a moment she almost considered it. They looked so happy. She had no recent memory of ever playing with other kids. The thought made her sad. I wish I could, Mikasa told the boy. He was sort of plump and smiley, round and happy. She found herself toying with the embroidery of her skirt. But I don't want to get dirty. Or what? The boy powdered and glanced at her dress. Come on, it'll be fun. You knew right. My name is Stefan, and you should definitely come play with us. I promise you won't get dirty. She stared at him for a moment or so and began to shake her head. No, she said. I can't play. Sorry. Oh. Stefan looked a little stunned. Some of the other children stopped to look at her, and she felt a little self-conscious. She pressed her lips together and waved awkwardly. They waved back in awe, confusion glinting in their large eyes. Mikasa couldn't help but envy them. I bet they have parents to go home to, she thought bitterly. A mother and a father. All she had was Levi. And she wasn't exactly sure what he was. Well, some other time. When the weather gets warm we play ball out here. Yeah, a tall girl said, jumping up beside Stefan. She had a long face and strangely limp brown hair that hung against her cheeks in a bulk of mousy strands. Her pug nose was faintly freckled and her eyes were a flaky green color, like leaves just beginning to change. We need more people anyway, since lots of the older kids stopped playing. Oh, Mikasa said. She had no idea what to say to that. Maybe. Awesome, the girl gasped. Her eyes were glittering. Where are you from, anyways? Your face is kinda... Stefan hissed, elbowing the girl. Don't be rude. The girl puffed out her cheeks indignantly. What? I wasn't. Was I being rude? No. Mikasa touched her face in spite of herself. She could feel how warm it was. Thank you, but I have to go now. She left them without another word. She had no time to waste. After all, Levi could appear home any minute and find an empty house. She was terrified of what he might say. So when she pushed the door of the bookstore open, she marched straight up to the woman at the counter. She was not quite elderly, but her bobbing sandy curls were shot through with wisps of gray. There were stress lines pressing tightly to the corners of her mouth, and she had eyes like frozen steel. She could see the ice-breathing mist into the air as it flaked and twitched against warmth. Hello, Mikasa said. She stood straight and tall. Her fingernails were digging into her palm. Hello, the woman said, her long finger pressing against the counter. She peered at Mikasa curiously. Are you lost? No. Mikasa took a step forward. I have something to ask. Oh? The woman smiled, but it was tight and strangely empty. And what is that? I don't have any money, Mikasa admitted. And I don't know where to get any. But if I helped you, cleaned up for you, or stacked books. Could you give me one? Just one. It doesn't have to be now. She shifted from foot to foot under the scrutiny of the woman's icy gaze. Please. You're asking me for a job. The woman looked almost confused. You don't have to pay me, Mikasa said. And I won't make much noise. You won't even know I'm here. A book as compensation for labor, the woman said, resting her cheek against her palm. Well, that's certainly new. She swallowed her fears and took a deep breath. Is that a no? No. The woman smiled. I have no grudges against children who want to read. Even better, you want to clean. She shrugged. Who am I to turn such a sweet offer down? Mikasa let out the breath she'd been holding, and she stared up at the woman with wide eyes. Thank you, she blurted. She couldn't help the jittery feeling of excitement as it clung to her. I can come at this time every day, if that's all right. Some days I might not. That's fine. The woman tilted her head, and her grey brows knitted together. Is there any book in particular you wanted? No. Mikasa looked around, and for a moment she felt lost. There were a few shelves, some of them lining the walls, others pressed back to back with narrow aisles between them. Beaten books were in uneven piles, discarded pages strewn across the floor. But I had a lot of time to look. There was some nervousness in returning home, but it seemed that Levi didn't notice that she had left the house. And so every day when he went out to do whatever work he did, Mikasa made sure not to ask, as she feared what she might hear. She then made the short journey to the bookshop. The woman, Loditana, was not particularly talkative, nor did she seem to notice Mikasa's presence half the time. She said that Mikasa could take a book whenever she wanted, but Mikasa was a little frantic when she realized she had no idea what book Levi might want. Sometimes when she finished up stacking new selections or sweeping the aisles, she'd begin to thumb through some of them. One day, when she was asked why she hadn't taken a book yet, Mikasa could only answer honestly. I can't choose, she said. The book isn't for me, and I want to be sure it's something he'd like. Oh? Miss Luddle looked amused, which made Mikasa feel silly. Who is the book for? Maybe I can help. Mikasa froze. She stood for a moment, her tiny body going rigid as she mulled over the word in her head. It was sweet and forbidden, like the taste of a secret wrapped in a glass of confusion and fear. My friend. She'd been about to say father. Okay, Miss Ludder said. Cupped her sharp chin between her fingers. Tell me about him. Mikasa obliged tentatively. She gave the woman a watered-down version of who Levi was. A quiet man who read a book of tales every day simply because of habit and a strange fondness. When Mikasa recounted the tales in the book, Miss Ludder gave a little laugh and she nodded. Oh, I know that book, she said. She peered at Mikasa and moved toward the back of the shop. She waved her fingers in gesture for Mikasa to follow. She stood before a rickety bookcase that was looking unrefined and rotted, with splintering frames and crooked shelves. Miss Ludder stood on her tiptoes to reach a dusty book, which was thin and fragile looking. It was papery and peeling, yellow pages thin and jagged from time eating at them. Age had damaged the book, and the cover was so worn that the title was unrecognizable. There was a bold impression of a sword burrowed into the weathered cover. It was a mossy green color, though perhaps it had once been a startling emerald. What's this? Mikasa asked, flipping carefully through the tiny book. The words were surprisingly bold for a book so battered. An old myth, Miss Ludder said. Heroes and knights, right? I'm sure your friend will enjoy it. Mikasa clutched the book tightly, and then she hugged it to her chest. Thank you, she said, staring up at Miss Ludder. I'll keep coming every day if that's all right. It's fine. Miss Ludder's eyes were like molten ice. How about I actually start paying you? Mikasa smiled, her head bowed. She thanked the woman again and left the shop in a hurry. The day was warm, a blanket of humidity washing over Yoko. The sun was turning the sky a burnt yellow color, clouds crumbling against the warm hue like brown bread flaking. The book pressed to her chest, wrinkled black leather held tightly to her crimson dress. She passed by Stefan and his gang, and she stopped for a moment to watch them scurry around the street, their laughter shrieking into the air. A ball bounced between them, ricocheting off shins and knees. Mikasa, the girl, Keith, cried out. She waved excitedly. "Come over here." Mikasa acquiesced, moving to the lanky girl's side. In the past weeks, Mikasa had stopped to chat with Stefan's ragtag bunch. The majority of them were well off, but there were some children who knew what it was like to go for a few days with an empty belly. "Hello," Mikasa said, hugging her book tightly. She turned her head to peer down the road. She was sure Levi would be back soon, and though she was excited to give him the gift, she was anxious about the inevitable questions it would instigate. "I can't stay." "You never do," another girl said, her angular nose wrinkling. She was much smaller than Keith, and younger too. Mikasa put her age as 6, and she had a round, chubby face and dazed brown eyes. There were a few gaps in her teeth, and her pale blonde hair crinkled around her cheeks in a frizzled spiral of curls. 2 tufts of yellow pigtails swirled around her ears. Her name was Ada. "Sorry," Mikasa said. "I should be heading home, though. Maybe I'll play tomorrow." Ada looked up at Mikasa with large eyes. "Really?" she gasped. "No," Stefan called, kicking the ball from foot to foot. "Like you said. Mikasa never plays, stupid." Mikasa frowned at him. "Don't call her stupid," Mikasa said quietly. "What?" Stefan's plump face was flushed from the exercise, and his hair was beginning to clump from sweat. It was a very warm day, after all. "You gonna do something about it, Mikasa?" He was taunting her with a broad grin. Mikasa's conversations with these children were often short, but she did know that they enjoyed her company. They seemed to find her mysterious, and it was funny to listen to them guess about her. For a moment she thought about it. "I could punch him," she thought. "Maybe." She closed her eyes. "No," she said, turning her back to them. She gave Ada a pat on the head. Her curls were coarse and wiry against Mikasa's palm. "I have to go now." She moved at a faster pace, her shoes clapping against the road as she went. She paused as she reached the house, sweat building at the back of her neck. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob, and she tilted her head back to peer down the street. A few passers-by hung at the end of the road, but otherwise the street was shadowed by the glow of the setting sun. "It's dark," she told herself as she entered the house, shutting the door behind her. "That's all." She set the book down on the table, smiling fondly at it. She rolled up her sleeves as she moved to the sink, washing her hands as she thought about dinner. That morning Levi had said something about soup, which was fine with her. She knew he'd be home soon, and he would probably take the reins from her, but the least she could do was start chopping up the ingredients. She'd been peeling potatoes when she heard a knock at the door. She paused, the dirt-caked skin hanging precariously over the garbage bin. Then she smiled a little to herself and set down the knife on the counter, wiping her hands off on a towel. She ran to the door, opening it with both hands and leaning against it as she opened her mouth to greet Levi. Immediately she saw her error. She slammed the door closed, but a boot slid between the opening, and the door was flung open again with a startling amount of force. She stumbled back, her body crashing to the floor as 2 men stood over her, brutish and shadowy. She lay for a moment, frozen in terror. "No," she thought numbly. She leapt to her feet, nearly stumbling as she backed away from the man. "Not again, please, no, not again." She was grabbed by the arm by one man, and his fist closed around her skinny wrist. She found herself yanking backwards, her heels digging into the floor. Levi's voice floated into her mind as the man's other hand came for her. "If anyone who isn't me touches you." Mikasa stared at the hand for half a heartbeat. And then she let a scream tear from her throat, listening as it burst through the air in a billow of terror and rage, and she ducked the hand, driving her shin between the man's legs. She didn't hear his cry of pain. All that concerned her was that he'd loosened his grip, and that was all she needed. She tore away from the man, stumbling and gasping, and she looked to the door hopefully, but the other man was blocking her way. Her heart hammered in her chest and she backed away slowly, her breathing fast and erratic. Then her eyes moved to the counter. The other man came at her just as she dove, and she reached up, grasping the hilt of the knife just as he tackled her. Her head smacked a cabinet, sending her vision into a bleary haze. Pain flashed through her like swallowing fire, and it warmed and thrashed her, forcing her to gasp a little. The man had her legs pinned down, but her arm was twisted above her head in an awkward, painful position that put too much pressure on her shoulder. He grabbed her around the waist, yanking her into the air. She struggled and screamed, her teeth clamping down onto his meaty hand when he tried to cover her mouth. He gave a shout of pain. "You little bitch," he snarled. She clenched the knife in her hand. He gave a strangled gasp as she sheathed the blade in his neck, just below his ear. She listened to the sound of it, to the wet rasp of a dying man, and she felt herself being dropped. She crumpled against the wooden floor, knocking against the cabinets and clutching her head. She blinked the stars that clung to her eyes away, and she stared at the convulsing man in horror. No, she thought, tears in her eyes. I didn't. I only meant to. She was completely stunned, shell-shocked and horrified, and the other man took advantage of that. Before she could scream again, his fist came crashing down on her cheek, and she was knocked into a bubbling, spitting sea of black flames. Chapter 5. The Storm Shakes the Shield. Levi didn't deceive himself. Mikasa's presence hadn't changed him, and he was still involved with dirty dealings. He took what jobs he could get. It was easy, and his reputation gave him leverage. And now that he had another mouth to feed, he had to work a little more. Sometimes he worked well into the night, and when he arrived home he'd find Mikasa had waited for him, often falling asleep before his appearance. Sometimes she would surprise him, though, and still be awake. In truth, he despised how attached she'd grown to him. He despised how attached he'd grown to her as well. Levi didn't mind caring about people. He just liked to limit himself to a select handful, and often he'd keep his distance from them for their sake in his iron. Mikasa was that disgusting anomaly that he couldn't shake. Quiet and obedient, like a puppy desperate to please. She was an inquisitive child, nonetheless, and often she prodded at a sore topic or tentatively tugged a bit of information out of him he hadn't meant to tell her. She was very good at getting him to speak. But he blamed that on their familiarity. A few months of living together would force him to become comfortable with her presence. When he reached his street, he knew there was something wrong immediately. He stood for a moment, the shadows around him dancing as the sun crept behind the horizon. And then he bolted, his instinct singing to him as he reached his door. It was ajar, and the sight of it caused his stomach to give an inevitable lurch. He swung the door open, swallowing Mikasa's name as it sprung to his tongue. There was no point on shouting it. One sweep around the room was enough to tell Levi that she was gone. There was a dead man. That was what amazed him. He took into account the half-peeled potatoes, the cabinet ajar, and the knife in the man's neck. "I'm sorry, Mikasa," he thought. He could feel his anger spiking, flooding him with ineffable rage. It bubbled over, and he resisted the urge to kick the corpse. No, he would leave it. Find someone to dispose of it in the tunnels, or report it, or something like that. He didn't really care for now. He was a little ashamed at the swell of pride that surfaced as he realized Mikasa had defended herself. He didn't know how to feel about any of this, but he did know one thing for sure. Whoever had done it was going to bitterly regret the first day they drew breath. "You," Levi said, lifting the man's head by his hair so his face was visible. "I know you, bastard." Levi knew just about everyone in Yolko. And so it wasn't hard to link the face of this gun to the culprit. Levi dropped the man's head and spun around. Just as he was about to exit, he spotted something on the table. A book. He stared at it for a few moments, trying to link it to the rest of the scenario he had built in his head. But he couldn't. Why was there a book here? Had Mikasa brought it home? He shook his head and left with his fingers instinctively checking every hidden weapon he carried. Rune cipher wasn't so hard to find. Anyone with real power in the underground could sniff her out in an instant. He was only concerned with how prepared she was to fight him. She, of course, was not much of a fighter. She had plenty of muscle to spare, however, which did shit on his confidence a little. Oh, Levi was going to go retrieve Mikasa. That much was a plain fact. But there was no telling what he would run into. Excuse me. Levi halted. The voice was high and reedy. A child's voice. He spun around and stared down at the cluster of children who were watching him. A girl said, small and chubby. She bit her lip with crooked teeth. Are you Mikasa's daddy? Levi watched her with a dull gaze. On the inside he was seething. Who are you? He asked. We are friends of Mikasa's, a round boy gasped, stepping forward. We talk to her whenever she goes to the bookstore. Bookstore? Levi's mind went back to the mysterious book and decided that it was an adequate explanation. Never mind. Did you see her today? Yeah, that. A pug-nosed girl scratched her head. That's the weird thing. When she came by, there were these weird men following her. At first we thought maybe one of them was you, but we've all seen you walk by and they were way too tall. Levi gritted his teeth. You saw she was being followed, he said in a low voice. And you sat on your asses and did nothing. The children looked up at him. Their eyes gleamed with terror. He shook his head. Children were children, and he knew that. They couldn't be blind. It didn't make him any less bitter though. You, Levi snapped, jerking his chin. Boy. Go find an MP and take them to my house. I found a dead body there, and I don't particularly want to see it when I get back. A body, the boy squeaked. Levi's eyes narrowed. Just go do it, he said, turning away from them. And be sure to mention that I found the body, or else they'll think I did that shit. Is that clear? Why, yes, the boy said. He blinked rapidly. Yes, sir. Good. Whatever questions the military police would have for him didn't matter. Because the man in Levi's home would lead them to Rune Cipher. If they actually gave a damn about nabbing her, then her own carelessness had led to her downfall. But Levi doubted they would particularly be bothered. He was certain the majority of the MPs in Yorkville knew him and turned a blind eye to him. After all, who did they have to thank for their balance in gang activity? Their smuggled items. Their prostitutes. Levi was disgusted with the people he surrounded himself with. He recalled the day after he'd saved Mikasa. The meeting he'd had with his employers. It had gone as well as expected. They hadn't attacked, but they had cursed him to hell and back. They'd never called on him again. They were like him in that they bounced around from employer to employer. It seemed that the person that had employed them that particular day had been Rune Cipher. And the woman had undoubtedly been pissed when she had seen Levi walking around with the girl she had paid for. Despicable filth. The tunnels went too hard to navigate. They went from narrow to expansive in the span of footsteps, and Levi easily found himself at the door of Rune Cipher's brothel. He entered quietly, the scent of intermingling perfumes, stale alcohol, and other fluids making him sick to his stomach. He didn't frequent at brothels, but he was certainly known here. He put the thought of his past dealings out of his mind. He ignored the public displays around him, which were nothing explicit. Levi didn't know for sure, but it was likely there were private rooms for sexual activities past fondling. There was a woman at the desk. Her face was severe, but her eyes lit up at the sight of him. Oh, Levi, she gasped. His fists clenched. Why, this is a surprise. You never come here when you're not on business. Why don't you sit down? Amira, come here. A slender girl came scurrying to his side, young and pretty with dark hair and dark eyes. She was smaller than him, and in the dim light he'd almost taken her for Mikasa. He realized that was why the girl had been chosen. Amira's arm reached out, and he snatched her wrist without thought. He stared at the woman at the desk, whose name he had forgotten, and he squeezed Amira's wrist until she gasped. The next person to try and touch me will have a broken wrist, Levi stated, shoved the girl back with so much force that she went flying to the floor. Now, don't try to play me, you fucking bitch, because I'm not in any mood for games. He gripped the desk with white knuckles and his rage got the better of him. He flicked his wrists back, pulling at the desk with a good portion of his strength. He took a few steps back and listened as it crashed to the ground. The entire room had gone deadly silent. His eyes were glowing dangerously in the dim light of the brothel, and he rested his boot against the busted desk. The woman watched him with horror in her face, and Levi exhaled sharply through his nose. She had been expecting him, but not his wrath. "What you want isn't here," the woman said. "You're lying." Levi stood up on the busted remains of the desk, raising himself above the woman. "You obviously knew I was coming. I'll leave this Surrey piss hole in peace if I get what I came for. If I don't..." Levi tilted his head. "I'll raise this damn place and smoke Rune out." Nobody moved. Levi looked around and spotted an MP or two, but they would never make themselves known to him. The woman stared at him, and from an entryway behind her, the devil herself stepped out. She smiled in a way that caused Levi's blood to boil, and he could feel his lips curling a little, his rage finally settling in his features. "Levi," she purred. "Why don't you come with me?" He stepped off the desk he had destroyed and stepped around it, his eyes never leaving Rune's. She was a callous woman, her brown eyes hard and cold, and her lips perpetually smirking. She was tall, and she could easily sway people into thinking she was harmless. She was, in fact, the polar opposite of Levi in every way he could possibly think of. And he despised her. "I suppose you want the girl," Rune said as he followed her into a hall. The building burrowed itself further into the ground, and Levi saw a flight of steps. He stared at them. "Why else would I stoop to this shithole?" he asked. "Oh, I don't know." Rune leaned down, careful not to touch him, but pressing her face rather close to his hair. He could smell her putrid perfume. "Even an emotionless half-man like you must get lonely sometimes. Isn't that why you stole my possession?" Levi stopped walking. He stared at Rune's back with such indescribable loathing that he could feel his clenched fists shaking in rage. Rune stopped, turning to face him with her eyes widening, feigning innocence. Her lips were curling though, amused and close to laughter. He could see it building in her eyes, like a storm about to unfurl. "I stole from you?" Levi asked, his voice low. "Did I really?" "Think real fucking hard, Rune, about who stole that little girl. Because it sure as hell wasn't me." "And you're so much better," Rune said, her eyes glittering. "Taking that little girl, hiding her away in your home. When I heard what you'd done, I couldn't believe it, but then I saw you with her." Rune's smile was poisonous. Holding her hand, leaning oh so close. It was almost sweet if it wasn't so vile. "Don't test me," Levi warned. "All I want is for you to let go of one little girl. Is that really so hard on your damned ego?" "This has nothing to do with my ego," Rune said. She studied him. "Though yours seems to be growing bigger by the day. Do you honestly think you can raise my establishment? Do you honestly think you can stop me?" She smiled. "Oh, no," she simpered. "Not me." "A bodyguard, then?" Levi raised his head high. "That little girl took one of them down without any training. I saw the body." Levi might have smiled with pride if he hadn't been so furious. She killed him quickly and precisely. She's smarter and stronger than you give her credit for. He stared at Rune, whose eyes had narrowed in obvious disdain. "She's obviously dangerous, Rune. You'll more than likely have a few deaths if you try to force her into anything she doesn't want to do. So just give her to me and we can minimize the casualties to the one you lost today." He was speaking very carefully, letting his mind work while his body went taut in apprehension. He was ready to fight. But if he could negotiate a way out of this mess, he'd be damned if he didn't at least try. "I've dealt with rowdy ones before," Rune said, waving offhandedly. "All she needs is to be broken." She's already broken, you monstrous bitch, Levi thought, resisting the urge to whip out a trusty knife and finish this monstrosity already. I'm giving you one more chance, Levi said darkly. Let her go, and I'll leave you alone. Rune watched him with her cold brown eyes, and her smile widened. Fine, she said, nodding. Come with me. Levi followed her down the steps he had noticed earlier, glaring at her back with such vigor that he was sure she would still feel his gaze in hell. She snatched a lamp from the wall and led him down further until they reached a row of cells. He saw girls and boys, some young, some older, and all of them watched him with the same haunted look in their eyes. His stomach twisted at the sight of their dead gazes. Is this what I send people to? He thought. I damned them to an empty life of pain and despair. And Mikasa's fate would have been no different if she had been a little older. Levi had always known how horrible he was. He had just never seen it thrown back in his face with a force that threatened to blow him to his knees. They stopped before a cell, and the light caused the girl to look up. She was no worse for wear than she had been that morning, except for the busted lip and dried blood cracking across her chin. It took a few moments for her to react, and then she leapt to her feet, her entire expression seeming to melt in a matter of moments. Levi, she cried, running for the door of the cell and staring up at him with glowing black eyes. He thought back to when he had first seen them. They had been just as dead as the children around them. But now they were very much alive, and so fucking hopeful it made him nervous. Because he knew this was a trap. But he couldn't help but be relieved when she reached through the bars, her fingers stretching toward him. He grasped her hand gently with his own, and he found his anger fluctuating. On one hand he was so relieved to see her relatively unharmed, but on the other, she was caged, trapped, and he had no idea what Rune was planning. You're okay, Levi clarified. He was very aware of Rune's heavy gaze. Tell me who hurt you. Mikasa stared at him for a moment before she jerked back. Behind you, she gasped. Levi spun around and slid away from the sharp lowering arc of an axe. He swung himself off the bars of the cell just as the man's axe collided with the metal. Sparks shot into the air on contact, and Levi noticed how the axe dug into the bars. He pushed himself so he was clinging to the man's arm, and then he swung his body so the knife he'd acquired could easily swipe through the man's beefy neck. He landed before Rune, kicking the bleeding man's legs out from under him. He went collapsing face first into a puddle of his own blood. He wasn't surprised when more goons arrived. Levi sighed, and he curled back in preparation. He fought without thought, but then he began to load them in. They were cumbersome and slow. And they hit the bars just as he expected. With every satisfying clang of metal, there was a wet sound of a blade grating against bone and blood spilling against the ground. Rune hadn't been expecting this. Bodies piled up around Levi, and all Rune and the Mikasa could do was stand there and watch as he raised. Levi was painted with blood by the time he finally kicked the bars of Mikasa's cell, using pressure against the many gashes on its face. The entire cage seemed to bend a little, quaking for a short moment before snapping under its own weight. Mikasa stumbled back as the door was kicked in at her feet. She stared for a moment, her mouth parting in awe. He looked around, but it seemed he had exhausted Rune's supply of guns. I'll be taking her now, he informed Rune. She stared at him. There was terror clear in her gaze. Levi was unsure of how many people he had just killed, but there were too many bodies. He had to climb over a few to reach Mikasa, and he held out his hand. She stared up at him, and she gave a weak smile, grasping it tightly and stepping out of the cell. Beneath him, he saw an arm flash out. His eyes widened in shock as something sharp sliced through his leg, hitting very near the back of his knee and forcing him to stumble and sway. He stumped on the not-quite corpse's hand with his good leg, but it was too little too late. He found that his right leg could not support him, and he went down with gritted teeth and flashing eyes. He snatched the knife that had done it from the ground and stabbed it through the twitching hand. Levi! Mikasa gasped, clambering over dead bodies to reach him. She bent down, and he scowled at her. Don't do that, he said, steady in his breaths. You'll get your dress all dirty. There were tears in her eyes, but she blinked them back and nodded, rising to her feet. She looked up at Rowan, and Levi watched as her expression went dead. "Are you the one," Mikasa asked, her voice similarly void, "who had those men come to my home and kill my family?" Rowan said nothing. She merely stared at the girl with eyes frozen open in terror. Mikasa's shoulders began to visibly tremble, and she continued to stare up at the woman until she seemed to have enough. She bent down, her fingers closing around the knife burrowed into the dead man's hand. She entered out and stepped forward. "Answer me," Mikasa said, raising her head high. She held the knife tightly in hand, and Levi tried to stand, but his right leg was bleeding too much already. He could feel it, seeping through fabric, pulling across the floor beneath him and soaking into the dirt with the rest of the blood. Rowan said, staring at the knife. "I may have suggested." Mikasa didn't need anything else. She leapt, but instead of stabbing the woman as Levi had expected her to, she instead kicked Rowan in the stomach. When she went tumbled down, Mikasa let the blade glide over the back of her leg. She took a good few steps back, still pointing the blade at Rowan. Her eyes had lost their spark as they stared. "If you come after us ever again," Mikasa said as Rowan gasped and groaned, "I'll take your entire leg." The corners of Levi's mouth twitched as Mikasa spun around and looked at him. She tossed the knife into her cell and climbed carefully over a few bodies. When she reached him, she reached out, but didn't touch him. Maybe she was too scared to. "Mikasa," he said, fully aware of how immobile he was at that moment. "Why don't you head home?" She gave him a long stare. She shook her head. "No," she said. "If you can't walk, I'll carry you." He found his brows furrowing. He didn't doubt the girl's strength, but he was definitely skeptical on this. He opened his mouth to object, but she was already grabbing his arms, her little body buckling a little as she hefted him onto her back. "No, this isn't necessary," he thought. He let it go, though. Mostly because, to his amazement, she steadied herself. She clutched his arms very tightly, and it almost hurt as she moved forward, climbing over corpses and carrying him to the exit. His bloody leg was hanging limply and aching as it continued to bleed out. It was true enough that he was impressed with her. She'd surpassed his expectations, and now it became very apparent just how much she seemed to care for him. He didn't know what to make of it. But not even Rowan's words had sullied what semblance of a bond they had. He rested his chin against her hair as Mikasa left the brothel, ignoring the looks they received. "What she did," Levi said quietly to her as she walked. "Why did you do it?" Mikasa walked for a little bit, her steps measured. When they reached the steps going up to the surface, she answered in the same quiet tone, "I only did what I thought you would do." It was simple and obvious. And it almost pained him. "I don't want you to be like me," he wanted to say. But it was already too late for him to say so. "I can walk now," Levi said. "We are almost home." "I said I can fucking walk," Levi said, preparing to drop himself. His eyes widened as she tightened her grip on his arms, preventing him from releasing himself. "Let me go, Mikasa." "I'm not stupid," Mikasa said, her voice giving the slightest hint of a waver. He knew he had to be heavy, or at the very least he was tiring her out. After what had just happened to her, he was alarmed that she could carry him at all. "I know how much you're bleeding. If I carry you, then we can get home faster." Of course, Levi knew a dozen ways to get her to let go. However, all of them would involve harming her in some way. No, he didn't want that. So he let her carry him as if he was the broken child and she was the determined adult. He had never expected this. Mikasa was well past the point of being attached to him, it seemed. The thought stirred his stomach, causing him to feel anxiety for whatever was to come. "Levi," Mikasa whispered, just as his eyes began to droop from exhaustion. The road was dark, and there were street lamps to flutter through the heavy blackness. The street was bathed yellow, and he saw shadows shifted on their stoop. "Who are those men?" Levi sighed into her shoulder. "MPs," he said. He felt her muscles go taut, and he shook his head. Don't be scared, he whispered. They won't do anything to you. But... no. Levi stared at her, but he couldn't see her face past her dark curtain of hair. You did nothing wrong. Mikasa, to her credit, never stopped walking. Levi wondered if she worried about dropping him, or if the strain was becoming too much. He knew he could be more assertive and force her to let go, but he was horribly curious about the extent of her strength. It was a cruel thing to do, but he couldn't help but wonder. Had he been so strong when he had been 9? He was sure he hadn't been. Excuse me, Mikasa murmured, stopping before the MPs who were sitting on the step leading to Levi's door. You're in the way. Levi could not see them, but he could feel the shifty gazes of them. We need an official statement from the man who lives here. It was all Levi could do not to audibly groan. They choose to do their jobs when it's the most fucking inconvenient. Mikasa, he said, let me down now. She complied this time, loosening her grip on his arms ever so slightly. Levi's leg throbbed as his feet rested against the ground, and he had to lean on Mikasa for support. He was a damned idiot for not reacting fast enough. And sure, he could blame Mikasa for distracting him, but it had been his own relief that had clouded his senses. The two men were lounging on the stoop, a bottle of alcohol between them. They looked at Levi with varying degrees of amusement and confusion and perhaps even fear. Their cheeks were flushed in the lamplight, and Levi was beyond pissed that they were still loitering around his home. If they had gotten rid of the body, then they had no more use to him. Fuck, MPs were way too much of a hassle. What the hell do you want? Levi asked, his voice blunt and a few degrees away from shaking. He needed to close the wound before he bled out, and he and Mikasa both knew it. Just tell us what happened to the guy in your house, sniffed one man. He slipped and fell on a knife, Levi said. He rolled his eyes when the men glanced at each other. What? Can you prove he didn't? Levi felt Mikasa's fingers tighten against the fabric of his jacket. Her tiny fists pressed into his back. Levi, she whispered. He ignored her. The men looked alarmed, and one lurched to his feet. We don't want to make this a bigger issue, he said, his voice slow but not slurred. Levi sensed that he wasn't quite drunk, just buzzed. Just tell us what really happened, and we'll let you off as easy as we can. Levi opened his mouth to retort, but Mikasa beat him to it. Her tiny voice was brisk and sharp against the night air. I killed him, she said boldly. Her expression was blank, and he could see her eyes. Dull and cloudy, broken and muddy as they searched the men's faces. They were overwhelmingly alarmed. He grabbed me. I got scared. I didn't mean to, but I had the knife in my hand, and he was behind me. Mikasa sounded soft and dead as she spoke, spitting words mechanically through tight lips. I couldn't say. Levi closed his eyes, his grip on Mikasa tightening. He wasn't sure if it was because he was irritated at her confession, or if he was simply buckling under the pain. Perhaps it was both. The men seemed to buy that. It was likely true anyway, and so they glanced at each other. And where were you? One man asked. Levi opened his eyes and met the man's gaze with a sharp one. Working. And how is this girl related to you? The other man asked suspiciously, peering at Mikasa's face. She's my niece. Now. Excuse us. There's a lot of damn blood we need to clean up. They grew tired of the interrogation and obliged as quickly as they could. The moment they were inside, he rounded on Mikasa. Why the fuck did you say that? He hissed. She stared up at him. Say what? She asked. That you killed him. Levi's eyebrows furrowed. Mikasa, everyone in this shithole of a town already knows I'm a criminal, they just don't have the balls or the evidence to convict me. You're not even registered as a citizen in Wall Sina, and yet you'll be on record saying you murdered someone. But they thought it was you, Mikasa said, looking blissfully ignorant to everything he had said. They would have arrested you. But they can't arrest me, can they? No, Levi said. But it might raise some questions if they actually give a shit about this and decide to check up on my family. You said. Mikasa helped him to the couch with a careful, steady hand. You said I was your niece. Yeah, and it was a shitty lie. Levi grimaced as he folded up the leg of his pants. The wound stung for a moment before the sting turned into a horrific throbbing. Shit. Go get the aid kit. It's in the bathroom. Mikasa was staring at the wound with a glimmer of horror in her eyes. There was blood on her mouth, dry and flaking as her lips parted. She quickly ran to the bathroom, looking as if there was fire licking at her heels. She returned within the minute, clutching a white box to her chest and resting it against the table. Her dull black eyes were watching the blood slide down Levi's leg like a thick, soupy red fountain. Shouldn't we close it? Levi gritted his teeth, but kept his face steely. She couldn't know how much pain he was in. I can't sew up the back of my leg, Levi said. I can do it. He looked at her, staring at her face and studying it. Yeah, okay, Levi said. She quickly went to digging through the box for a needle and filament. Make sure you sterilize the needle first. Okay. She found the needle and a ball of medical twine, and she threaded it without thought. Where? Light a candle, Levi said, and hold the needle inside the flame so it can kill the germs. Mikasa didn't need to be told anything else. She did exactly as she was told, and then she came back to his side with the needle pressed between two fingers. She had a towel and base in hand, and he closed his eyes as he straightened out his leg a little for her to mop up the blood. The cloth burned immediately on impact, but his only reaction was to tense up his shoulders. Have you ever done this before? He asked her. My mother taught me to sew. She said slowly. There's a difference between sewing fabric and sewing up skin, Mikasa, Levi sighed. I know that. She set the crimson-soaked cloth into the basin of water. And I can do it. Lay down. He couldn't help but stare at her for a few moments. She wasn't acting like a girl who had just killed someone, a girl who had just been kidnapped and beaten, only to watch half a dozen more men killed upon her release. He had underestimated her strength from the very start. Mikasa Ackerman wasn't a broken doll. She was a survivor. The process of the stitching took almost 40 minutes. Mikasa was being so careful and meticulous that the stitches felt much sturdier than expected when she was done. Of course, it had caused more blood loss, resulting in him feeling lightheaded. She patched him up with gauze and tape, and by the time she began to mop up the blood on the floor, well, Levi was half drunk on the pain. Mikasa, he said, feeling drowsy as he slumped against the couch. That book. Where the hell did you get it? She stopped scrubbing at the floor for a few moments to look up at him. Her face was hazy to him, fuzzy and blinking in and out of focus. She went back to running a rag across the bloodstains that seemed to seep into the floorboards. He could see her black hair fluttering around her cheeks as she moved, and the sound of cloth scraping against wood, suds bubbling up and popping in a splash of red water. I worked for it. He couldn't help but become alert at that. What? He asked. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Mikasa said, wringing out the rag, that I earned it. And it was legal. If you were wondering. Well, Levi said, closing his eyes. He had to blink a few times. Why buy a book? That shit could have gone to way better use. Like food. I didn't buy it, Mikasa said. I worked for it. At the bookshop down the road. She dropped a rag into a basin and began to wipe up the leftover water. You did what? Mikasa looked at him, and then she stood up, setting the basin on the counter. She washed her hands, and he listened to the water running as his eyelids drooped. They snapped open again when she sat down beside him. The couch cushion sunk with her weight, and when he looked at her he saw the book resting in her lap. It's for you, she whispered, resting it against his thigh. He felt a little stunned momentarily. I wanted to give you a book. Another one. I didn't ask you to, Levi said, pressing his hand to the book's leathery cover. It felt very worn. He could barely make out any letter of the title, except perhaps AJ. No, she said quietly. She seemed small then, looking nervous and sounding uncertain. That's why it's a gift. He picked the book up gingerly, running his thumb across the faded green sword that was engraved into the black cover. He held it for a long time, staring at the worn-away words. He simply couldn't discern the scuffed-out letters, and so he began to flip through it. The pages were beaten and yellowed, crisp lines marking where past readers had dog-eared corners. "You stupid girl," he murmured, closing his eyes. She said nothing for a few minutes. Levi almost dozed off. "Sir Gawain and the Grey Knight," Mikasa said suddenly. "What are you talking about now?" Levi asked, muffling a yawn. "The title." Mikasa took the book, and Levi heard the fluttering of pages. "Sir Gawain and..." He was asleep before she could finish her sentence. The sound of her quiet voice lulled at his senses, sending him into a blanket of easy blackness. Chapter 6. The Snowdrop. The months slipped away from them as Levi's leg healed slowly. He tried to hide it as best he could. He began to take Mikasa out with him as a precaution, his paranoia creeping. She followed him without complaint, though he realized quickly that he was in the wrong to drag her into his crimes. Sure, she was useful when relaying messages or spying, but he wanted to keep her in the dark to the extent of his sense. He noticed one chilly day, after a week of wind chills and severe storms, that Mikasa looked paler than usual. It was over breakfast that he studied her movements as she read his book in silence. It was his old book of fairy tales that she read, her head bent low and her hair pulling across the pages in thick inky strands. Her spoon rested forgotten against her left palm, her porridge untouched. "Eat," Levi said. Mikasa looked up suddenly, blinking at him with a murky gaze. Her eyes were glassy, dazed into a trance. He found himself growing increasingly concerned. "Mikasa, is your nose running?" "No." Levi stood up, watching as her body went a little tense. Yes, he'd caught her in a lie. It was apparent in the way she tucked her chin to her chest. He maneuvered around the table, standing over her with his chin raised high. He stared down his nose at her and frowned a little at the way she shrunk away from him. It wasn't that she was scared of him. Levi knew her enough by now to assume that she was simply ashamed of whatever ailed her. He dropped to one knee and grabbed her by her hair, tilting her head back. He shoved a napkin against her face, grimacing as he pinched her nose. "Blow," he ordered. She took the napkin from him, acquiescing in blowing her nose against the handkerchief. He made careful haste to smooth back her hair, pressing his palm against the skin of her forehead. The heat that radiated from beneath was enough to convince him, but he checked once more with the back of his hand anyway. The results were the same. Mikasa was unnaturally warm, and her pallid skin was clammy to the touch. "You're warm and gross," Levi said. "How long have you been sick?" She lowered her gaze, and he could see her cheeks gain a slight tint. She sniffled, wiping at her nose as she lowered the napkin. "Oh." Her voice sounded much more congested now. "I don't know." "Idiot," Levi spat. He resisted the urge to grab her by the hair again. He spun away from her, moving toward the sink to wash his hands. "Go wash yourself, and then go to bed." "But..." Mikasa fidgeted, and he glanced back at her as he scrubbed at his knuckles. "I'm not tired." "Do I look like I give a fuck about whether or not you're tired?" Levi flicked off the faucet, drying off his hands against the towel hanging beside the sink. "You should have told me you were sick immediately." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Levi said through gritted teeth. "Just do what you're told." And she did. She didn't need any more goading. She fled into the bathroom quite fast, leaving behind an uneaten breakfast and a solid napkin. Levi sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. He didn't mean to be so harsh on her, but he wasn't quite sure how else to deal with her. Why didn't she just tell me? Levi stared at his beaten old fairy tale book, and if he really looked, he could still see the ghosts of stain smeared across the cover. He flipped the book over, making a mental note to disinfect it later. He left Mikasa a pair of clothes outside the bathroom door, and then he shrugged on a jacket over his thin cotton shirt. It was black and a little shabby, but he owned nothing that was particularly nice. The rain had turned to sleet overnight, and there was a thin coating of ice licking at the stone streets. He pulled up a hood, shoving his hands into his pockets as he ducked through the downpour. He walked with a bowed head and a heavy heart, wondering why Mikasa had hid it from him. It bothered him much more than it should have. "Schatz," Levi said, letting himself into the small tavern. The woman was actually serving someone, which honestly confused him. It must have been later than he thought. "Well, hey," Schatz said, cracking a lazy smile. "If it isn't the little bastard himself. What do you need this time?" Levi stood for a few moments, staring at the splotchy-faced woman. Greta Schatz was not particularly pretty, nor could Levi ever remember he'd been so. She'd always been plain, with a horribly impish look about her. Even now, with her alert gaze and coy smile, she seemed a little off. Levi didn't know why he kept wandering back to her. It was probably more about trust than anything else. At least he knew she'd never turn him in. "Do you have anything to treat a fever?" he asked slowly. He felt awkward going to Schatz for this. He knew he should get a real doctor involved eventually, and he would. If Mikasa's condition worsened. But for now, he had to assume it was a normal cold. It better be, he thought, scratching at his cracked knuckles pensively. There were some cold memories he did not want to dig up. "Let the dead lie," he whispered to himself. "Do I look like an apothecary?" Schatz asked. "No," Levi said, "you look like a sleazy barmaid." "Don't fuck around with me, Greta." "Not today." Schatz looked a little stunned that he had used her first name. Levi hated to act too familiar around Schatz, though sometimes he wondered if it was obvious how long they had known each other. Schatz was very nearly 10 years older than him, and it often felt like more than that. In all honesty, being around her made him feel like a sullen child again. He was thankful she didn't treat him like one anymore. "Oh," Schatz said. She glanced at other person at the bar, an elderly woman, and she chose to ignore her. "The kid got sick." "How'd you let that happen?" "It was the weather," Levi said. He told himself that. And after all, Mikasa was from rural Walmaria. The living conditions were likely different within a town, or even a city, if Yolkul could be considered that. It could be any number of variables that had set off the illness. But it had nothing to do with germs. Levi was certain of that. "Yeah, okay." Schatz waved him over. "I think I have something in the back that you can use." Levi followed her into the storeroom, which was unsurprisingly stocked to the brim with various bottles of alcohol and herbs. He let Schatz do the sifting. He was surprised she even managed to keep the drug stash, but then again, they were both in deep with the wrong sorts of people. He didn't know why anything surprised him anymore. "Okay," Schatz said, "this stuff isn't usually used for medical use." "Schatz," Levi said. "This is for a 9-year-old girl. If it's dangerous or addicting, I'm not taking it." "Then go to a doctor," Schatz stated dryly. He ended up accepting the hodes tentatively. They were in a small pouch, and when he pulled at the drawstrings it yawned open. "I'm not going to give her this shit if it makes her sicker," Levi said, yanking the pouch closed. Schatz frowned and folded her arms across her chest. Her expression was a little exasperated, and he leaned back against a shelf to study her. She was getting old. That was strange to think about. But then, he thought, she's always been old. "Have a little faith in me, Levi," Schatz said, her eyes drooping a little. "I'm a little more experienced with kids than you are. This will work." He couldn't argue with her on that front. She was undeniably correct. She knew much more about taking care of a child than he did. But didn't it count for something that he was trying? Didn't she see how frustrating this was for him? Levi had to close his eyes to keep his anger in check. Why didn't she just tell me? "Sir," Levi said, tossing the pouch from hand to hand. "Do I just make a tea with this shit?" "Yeah, that should work." Schatz smirked, and then she peered at him with her sharp blue eyes alight. "Hey, when was the last time you were sick, anyway?" He said nothing. He stared down at the pouch of herbs and he wondered if she could read his face like she used to. He doubted it. Time had hardened him as tempering did a sword. One wave of crushing horror after enough, dipping him into a sea of cruel realities and bloody drains. But even so, he's found himself immersed in a chilly silence. He looked up at her, his eyes boring into hers. For a moment, she looked startled, her lips parting and closing. He turned away from her, exiting the storeroom without speaking a word. When was the last time he had been sick? When was the last fucking time? The memory was cold. Everything had been cold, and his thin cotton sheets had done nothing but cling to his sticky skin as he'd shivered and shuddered, blinking in and out of consciousness. He recalled the smell of vomit, the taste of it fresh on his tongue. And he remembered opening his eyes, light streaking across his vision in a stinging ribbon of yellow and white. He remembered a hand sliding beneath his neck, propping his body up ever so slightly. And he remembered the bubbling in his chest, the painful build-up of something festering inside him. A monster, he had thought. It had grown inside of him, and now it was clawing its way up his throat, tearing away chunks of his insides with steely claws. The cough released had been monstrous, tearing away from a tiny body like it had been fighting forever to be released. It had left him shaking as it cracked and trembled across the air, sharp and relentless, and when it was done it had left his throat raw. His mouth had tasted bitter, like he'd gnawed on metal. He had felt the blood dribbling down his chin. He wished he could call it a small miracle that he had survived that. But it hadn't been. No. He had been delirious. Dazed, weak, and fumbling for some sort of salvation. But he remembered speaking. He remembered it with the clarity of clouds suddenly parting from his senses. He had fought against a steady hand, staring at the bowl full of a pasty substance with glazed eyes and a parted, bloody mouth. No, stop. Levi. He turned to look at Schatz. He tried to recall the girl from his memory, but in all honesty he had no idea if Schatz had been there or not. It had never been an important detail of that particular memory, so he'd forgotten it. Did it matter? No. He didn't care if Schatz had seen him as a weak, dying child. Because Schatz was not important. Schatz had been there, or she hadn't, he honestly had no clue. Someone else had been there, though. Hey, what did I say this time? Schatz asked. Nothing. Levi found he was very annoyed with her. As useful as she was, she could be nosy and chatty. And worst of all, he felt that for all of the time they'd been around each other, sometimes it was like they didn't know each other at all. But then, what the hell did Levi know? Schatz was the closest thing he could call family. Except, of course, Mikasa. No, I definitely set you off. Schatz drummed her fingers against the bar and frowned at him. Come on, tell me. Is it something obvious? Schatz, Levi said. No. He shook his head and walked away. He didn't bother thanking her. She didn't deserve it. Ron, a small voice in his head murmured. Always rum about everyone, aren't you? Levi glared ahead of him. Whatever the shit Schatz had given him had better be worth it. The chill was creeping up his spine. Rain and ice gathered around feet, cracking beneath his boots as he walked. He was clutching the pouch full of hodes in one hand, shielding it from the slate with his sleeve. The cold was biting at him, laughing with a sharp tongue, and it lashed against his cheeks. He had to remind himself that Mikasa was not him, and what happened in his own childhood was far from what was happening to her. It was just a cold. Children got colds, right? He couldn't pretend to be an expert on children. Likewise, he couldn't pretend he knew what he was doing when he was taking care of Mikasa. It was odd, feeling clueless. And it was total bullshit. When he got home he put the kettle on and stared at the pouch of herbs. There wasn't much in there. He frowned and prepared a cup with haste. If anything, he did trust Schatz. There was no reason for this not to work. And so he shouldered open the door to his room, cup in hand, and he stood in the doorway for a moment as he peered at Mikasa's bundled form. She was curled up beneath the blankets, nothing but a tuft of black feathers visible from the top of the cocoon. The cup was searing into his palm as he edged closer to her. "Mikasa," he said. She stirred almost immediately, and the blanket slid from her face as she propped herself up on her elbow. She blinked rapidly, murky black eyes swimming in an unfocused glaze. "Levi," she murmured, rubbing at her eye with the heel of her palm. "Don't touch your eyes," he said, swatting her hand away. "Or your nose, or your mouth." "Oh," she said, her voice thick with sleep and congestion. "Okay." "Sit up," he said, pressing his hand between her shoulder blades. She obliged, the blanket crumpling into her lap. She asked no questions when he held the cup to her lips, and again he was finding himself comparing her behavior to his own. She gulped the tea down without complaint, taking it in her hands and staring into the emptiness of the cup when she had finished. For him, it had been quite different. "No," he had rasped, blood pooling on his tongue and spraying into the air. "No, stop." He recalled the feeling of his nails raking against flesh as he fought, the rim of a bowl pressing to his ashen lips. "Gee, get it away." "Hey," Mikasa said quietly, still staring into her cup. "Levi." He looked down at her and then turned his face to the window. The shutters rattled against the wind. "Yeah," he asked. "Can you?" She bit her lip and she bowed her head low. He noticed how her hair obscured her face, and he frowned. "Can you read to me?" That was not what he had expected. At all. "What?" he asked, blinking down at her. "Why?" "You know how to read." "Yeah." Mikasa tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. "I tried, but the words are blurry. My eyes keep watering." Mikasa's face was unreadable, but Levi could tell that she was earnest. He couldn't help but wonder there. Was this the girl's strange play at manipulation? It might have been amusing if he hadn't fallen for it. Levi knew he could have said no. "No. You need to get some sleep." Or, "No. I'm not your father and I don't have to do anything for you." He took the book of fairy tales from the beside table. "Which one?" he asked, flipping open the cover. "The Shadow." Levi raised his eyes to hers and he tilted his head. Of course, he'd read the book more times than he could count. So he knew each story quite well. "Don't you want something?" He drummed his fingers against the cover and grimaced. "Happier." "That's the story I left off on," Mikasa said. Levi shrugged. "Suit yourself." His voice softened as he began to read, and he took pauses every so often to check Mikasa's face. She was steadily beginning to drift off into slumber, her muddy black eyes growing heavy with every crisply spoken word. She held on, though, and listened to every word with her eyes following the movements of Levi's lips. "One day the master said to the Shadow, 'We have grown up together from our childhood, and now that we have become traveling companions, shall we not drink to our good fellowship, and say the and out to each other?'" Levi's fingernails dug into the book's leathery cover. "What you say is very straightforward and kindly meant," said the Shadow, who was now really master. "I will be equally kind and straightforward. You are a learned man and know how wonderful human nature is. There are some men who cannot endure the smell of brown paper, it makes them ill. Others will feel a shuddering sensation to their very marrow if a nail is scratched on a pane of glass. I myself have a similar kind of feeling when I hear anyone say that to me. I feel crushed by it, as I used to feel in my former position with you. You will perceive that this is a matter of feeling, not pride. I cannot allow you to say that to me. I will gladly say it to you, and therefore your wish will be half fulfilled." Then the Shadow addressed his former master as the... He paused. The rain beat at the window relentlessly, dribbling down the glass like rivulets down a pallid chin. Mikasa was watching him with her murky eyes in a daze. "Levi," she said. "Levi, your hands are shaking." He closed the book with a snap and set it back down on the bedside table. "Go to sleep," he said, snatching the cup from her hands and resting it beside the book. "What's wrong?" Mikasa asked, bolting up straight as he turned away from her. His footsteps were heavy as he reached the door. "No. No, stop." He froze at the door, his fingers hovering over the knob. Don't go. He stared at his fingers. They were white and trembling with rage. Why? He gritted his teeth. What the fuck am I so angry about? He left the room, slamming the door behind him. He listened, wondering if he might hear the sound of a child sobbing if he waited long enough. But if Mikasa was upset, she made no sign of it. And Levi rested his back against the door, slumping as his body slid down to the floor, his legs folding beneath him. What am I doing? He wondered. What am I doing? That was the problem. He didn't know. The illness passed easily and the weather got worse. Slush clung to the streets, brown and mushy and glistening in the sun. Levi cajoled the date of her birth out of her, but was a little lost when he realized something crucial. He had no idea what to do for her. It was undeniably stupid, but he felt compelled to do something. Stop that, Levi snapped at her the morning of her birthday, after catching her throwing snowballs with the other children on the street. He had her by the wrist, and he forced her to drop the icy, white and brown slush. It fell to the ground and burst upon impact, 1,000 glittering crystals shattering against stone. The other children had stopped in shock of him, staring at him with fear glistening in their eyes. Levi studied Mikasa's palm, which was an angry red color, bitten ready by the snow. Are you trying to get sick again, idiot? I was just playing, Mikasa said. She had the gall to sound almost confused. Yes, Levi said, because throwing ice shit at each other looks so fun. And sanitary. He grasped her wrist tighter. Let's go. Mikasa looked a little stunned as she was dragged away from the other children by the hand. Her palm was icy against his, like porcelain glass. Her hair was bundled around her shoulders, windswept and feathery. She hung close to Levi's side and stared ahead with her mouth parting up at him. Her fingers closed his, frozen and wet. I'm sorry, Mikasa said. I really was just playing. For a moment, Levi truly felt sorry for snapping at her. Next time, he said, tossing her hand away to open the door, wear gloves. Mikasa stared at him. She nothing, but appeared rather stunned. She stood, cupping her hands as he paused in the doorway. He glanced back at her. What? He asked. What's that fucking face for? What are you doing home? Mikasa asked, rubbing her knuckles pensively. He wondered if her fingers were numb from the snow. What do you mean? I mean, Mikasa said, giving him a long stare, you're never home at this time. Ever? Well, I came home early. Her eyes narrowed. She doesn't believe me, he thought. I can take a day off, you know. Can you? What? Levi scowled. You want me to leave? No, Mikasa said. I want you to stay. Then what the hell is your problem? Mikasa wound her sleeve around her hand, sending the red hue a deep crimson from the wetness of her palm. She shrugged and stepped up onto the stoop. You're acting stupid, she told him. Stupid? He stared at her face and he shook his head. I'm the stupid one. Just get in here already, you little bitch. She did, but only after giving him a rather sharp look. She slipped off her boots at the door and ran to wash her hands before Levi could snap at her. When she was done, she wandered over to the couch where he was sitting. What is that? She asked, staring at the small parcel he had produced from his pocket. He spun it between his fingers, the paper crumpling against the pressure. There was a red ribbon wrapped around the parcel twice and spun into a bow. He felt awkward as he continued to spin it. She sat down tentatively beside him, watching the movements of his fingers with attentive eyes. Levi. Here. He held it out to her lazily. Happy birthday. She stared at the parcel with her eyes flashing wide. She took it delicately into her hands, as if she thought it might shatter at any moment. Oh. Mikasa shook her head, and she looked at him with her face melting into a confused sort of daze. You didn't have to. Just open it, Levi sighed, slumping against the couch. Okay. She bit her lip and carefully tugged at the red ribbon. It unfurled into her hand, and she rested the parcel on her lap, pulling the ribbon up to her face. It swung lazily, curling against the air in a silken gleam of crimson. What? Levi studied her face. It's just a damn ribbon. It's... Mikasa seemed to struggle to find the right word. She touched the ribbon tenderly with the tips of her fingers. Pretty. Pretty. Levi stared at the child, wondering how on earth her fucked-up mind worked. He was struck with an idea. He plucked the ribbon from between her fingers, much to her alarm, and he touched her shoulder gently. Here, he repeated, brushing her hair aside. Turn a little bit. She turned her back to him, and he gathered up her feathery black hair, sliding the ribbon beneath it. He wrapped it carefully around her head and angled it to the right as he tied the loose ends into a bow. When he was done, her long hair was pushed back from her face except for the shorter strands that simply refused to stop framing her cheeks. He watched her touch the bow with tentatively fingers. Ha, Levi said, studying her face as she turned back to him. No, that's no better. I like it. You haven't even seen it, Levi said, rolling his eyes. I don't need to. She picked up the parcel again, the corners of her lips turned up. I know that I like it. You're a weird fucking kid, Mikasa, Levi said. He watched her peel back the paper, trying very hard not to rip it. When she finally got the gift free, she stared at it for a very long time. She picked up the small dagger, which was in a leather sheath. She ran her fingers over it, her eyes drooping a little as she closed her fingers around the sheath and yanked at it. It came off easily and revealed a gleaming blade. Levi could see the girl's reflection in the glistening edge. She held it up to the light, and her head tilted curiously. I want you to keep it on you all the time, Levi said. Just in case someone tries to steal you again. I don't want to kill anyone else, Mikasa said quietly, sheathing the blade once again. The words sunk in. They were pitifully sad, and he watched and wondered. He'd killed a lot of people. He sometimes did it without thought or feeling or remorse. He did it because he was angry sometimes, like when Mikasa had been captured. Both times he had needlessly spilled more blood than he'd intended. And that had been his own rage working against him. The rage was building up. He could feel it bubbling beneath his skin. A small child might say, I don't want to kill anyone. And they could mean it with all of their broken little heart. But what did that mean in the end, when the child was crouching in a corner, blood bathing his arms and spattered across his pale little face, and he clutched a knife so tightly in his hands that it bit into his skin? He rested a hand on Mikasa's head, his fingers burying into the inky feathers of her hair. Mikasa, he said quietly. The world is too cruel for wishes like that. She said in silence, fingering at the hilt of the blade. Her thumb drew across the cross guard, and her shoulders hunched a little in tension. Maybe, she said, her voice drifting in its soft, vague way. She raised her fingers to the red ribbon tied atop her head, and she gingerly ran them across the bow. But don't you think that maybe it can be beautiful too? His hand dropped to his side. Her words were odd and silly, but they hit him hard nonetheless. They were genuine and heartfelt, spoken hesitantly and doubtfully. As if she wondered if she was in the right to believe so. Levi turned his face away from her. Maybe, he said softly, closing his eyes. Maybe. As the weather got warmer, Levi began to take Mikasa up to the roof at night to watch the stars. At first she had been rather stunned that he could suggest something so trivial. But then, his only book for a good portion of his life had been a book of fairy tales. Watching the stars was not something so incredibly outlandish, was it? They often didn't speak when they did this. Sometimes Mikasa even fell asleep in her perch, her back resting against the slant of the roof. But that was rare. She was more alert than him usually, and she had her eyes upon the stars, with her eyes glowing in their childlike contentment. When she had asked why he did this, he told her the truth. When he'd been younger, he had watched the stars. Me too, Mikasa admitted quietly. He looked at her, watching her hug her knees to her chest. Her head was hung back, and her black hair blended into the night around her, fluttering against the breeze. Really? He asked. Yeah. Mikasa's head rested against the shingles behind her. My papa would wake me up sometimes if the night was clear. She sounded distant and sad. Did anyone ever watch them with you? Levi gritted his teeth. He closed his eyes, letting the visions of glinting lights in the sky die into hollow blackness. He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to lie and say that no one had ever cared for him enough for that. She would believe that, wouldn't she? But he didn't lie. Sometimes, he said. Not often. Shetz would sit with me if she found me on the roof. He scoffed and opened his eyes. Mostly because I wouldn't go back inside, no matter how much she fucking screamed. He grimaced at the memory. Shetz. Mikasa turned to face him. The lady from the tavern. It was easy to forget that Mikasa knew next to nothing about him. Yeah, her. Levi stared upward and he shrugged. I never told you about her. You said you didn't trust me. Did I? Levi didn't remember that. Oh. Well, she's a fucking bitch. But a trustworthy one, at least. You told me that. Levi gave her a sharp look, which she ignored promptly. Sometimes she's too bold and sometimes she's too meek, Levi thought. There's no winning. Do you really want to know? Yes. She sat up straighter to face him. Why did she scream at you? She's not your mum, is she? He almost laughed at that. He managed a grimace and he shook his head a little in disgust. No, not my mom. He shrugged a little. I grew up with her. At an orphanage. You're an orphan, she asked, staring down at his face. He was leaning back and she was leaning over him. Her hair was tickling his cheek. He thought he could hear the unspoken too resonating against the wavering breeze. I don't know. Levi didn't like talking about himself. But he felt that he owed it to Mikasa. At least a little bit. She had stuck with him despite everything, and she was not the worst sort of family to have. Maybe she had the right to know. Apparently I was found wandering the streets when I was 2, or some dumb shit like that. So I couldn't tell you what happened to my parents. Well then, Mikasa said, her eyes widening, how do you know your name is Levi? Didn't your parents call you that? No. Levi let the stars burn into his eyes. The orphanage did. Before they found me, I was no one. Is that why you don't have a last name? Yep. The silence spread out between them, flexing like wings about to take flight. And then a gust of wind slammed against them, sending them clinging to the roof for support. Black feathers tangled against the air and then settled against hunched red shoulders. Do you want a last name? She asked suddenly, shattering the silence. What? Admittedly, he had not been paying attention. He had no idea what she could mean by that. You could be Levi Ackerman, Mikasa said, her dark eyes shadowed in the darkness. That sent a strange sort of shudder through his stomach. That sounds stupid, Levi said flatly. Oh. Levi said nothing else out of fear that he might agree with her. He wasn't certain how long she had lived with him. Over a year, certainly. And the truth was, he was all too comfortable with Mikasa Ackerman. He felt an attachment to her that he couldn't say he felt for anyone else. Family. He had family. He, the boy who no one had ever wanted, had a family in this stupid, broken little girl. And he was fiercely protective of that. One day he'd been teaching her to braid her hair after realizing that the length might annoy her at times. She sat on her knees, her fingers lazily gliding against the thick feathers of her hair. She was clumsy, uncertain of where to fold in and fold out. She began to get it eventually. Can I braid your hair? Mikasa asked, letting go of the dainty braid she'd created. He captured it and pulled it into the thicker braid he was creating at the back of her head. No. Levi fitted it a little, his legs folded beneath him. My hair is too short. I could do it. He rolled his eyes. You're too confident, Levi said, tying up the bottom of the braid with her red ribbon. It had become a favorite of hers. She refused to not have it on. Try if you want. She turned to face him, her smile small and almost secret as she scooted closer, tugging at the ends of his hair. He winced as she kept tugging and began to twist at the dark strands around his ears. Levi sat patiently as he waited for her to give up. Of course, she didn't, and he was left to deal with her relentless tugging until she tapped his shoulder and said to him, "I need to tie it." "I don't have a tie." The girl seemed to slump a little in disappointment. She let the small braid go and it unfurled against his ear, bursting apart without her fingers to pinch it together. She looked nice with her hair pulled back, almost put together in comparison to her usually unkempt appearance. He had no right to talk. Just as often as he tried to make himself look presentable, he looked like a thug. They both leapt to their feet as the sound of loud voices crept from behind the door. Mikasa ran to the window, throwing it open and peering into the street as they watched trails of people go rushing down the walkways, babbling and whispering and crying out into the air in panic and shock. Levi stood for a moment, his fingers resting subconsciously against the knife strapped beneath his sleeve. He could hear words drifting against the den. Colossal. And the Titans. And the Wall Maria. And worst of all, fallen. "Mikasa," Levi said, his stomach twisting horribly. "Shut the window." But Mikasa's fingers were wide against the window frame. "Wall Maria." Levi wanted to tell her that it wasn't important. He wanted to slam the window shut, to grab her by the shoulders and tell her that it wasn't important at all, that everything was fine. How foolish that was. How idiotic and cruel he'd be to lie to her like that. He would not be protecting her by shielding her from the world. He'd be killing her. "Grab your sweater," Levi ordered. Mikasa turned to look up at him, her braid bobbing against her back. "Let's see what's going on." Mikasa ran to her room while Levi was left to stare out the window. The drifts of people began to thin out as they moved. Wall Maria, Levi thought. Fallen to Titans. The thought seemed too horrible to entertain. He shuttered the windows once more and walked to the door. Mikasa exited her room, moving to Levi's side and taking his hand. He gripped it tightly, pulling her into the street without hesitation. They moved quickly and quietly, slipping between the crowds as they moved closer to the gates. As always, Mikasa stuck close to his side, and they reached a standstill as the crowds became congested. "What's going on?" Mikasa asked. Levi, in all honesty, had not much of a clue. He heard men called for the crowd to part not too far ahead, and the sound of hooves clopping against stone above the din of voices. Cries of questions and confused shouts. He gripped Mikasa tighter, and he looked around. He spotted a rail nearby, and he jerked his chin at it. She didn't need to be told anything, and they both pushed through the swarm. Levi climbed atop the rail and jumped, catching a gutter and flipping himself easily onto the precarious slant of the roof. He waited and watched as Mikasa moved fluidly after him, mimicking his movements to near perfection. He grasped her arm as she landed beside him, her braid falling against her shoulder. The red bow fluttered a little against the wind. "Levi," she said, blinking up at him. He pulled her up and dragged her across the rooftop, holding onto her hand tightly. He stopped, letting his body rest against its perch. He saw the crowd parting for the downtrodden figures coming up through the street. What is this, Levi thought with disgust, a parade of the weak? Levi could only find the side of these people, who obviously had seen hell, to be humiliating and tiresome. Aren't they? The Survey Corps, Levi said, resting his shoulder against the roof. They don't usually come by this way. They passed by the ground below, green figures moving slowly, as if the entire world had fallen atop their shoulders. The world was pinning down the wings of freedom. It was a funny thought. The trudging movements of the soldiers made them look jaded and sad, and Levi couldn't grasp what drove them forward. Humanity, he thought, is so fucking strange. As Levi studied the faces below, he suddenly froze. He could feel his body coiling with tension as one face stuck with him, floating against the chasm of his mind. His fingernails dug into the shingles of the roof as he stared, the familiarity stinging like a slap in the face, ricocheting like a phantom voice in the dark. The horror settled quickly. The rage burst through him like a flame that had never quite gone out, sputtering into life again with a vehemence. "Look up, Levi dead," his heart hammering inside his chest with an unsteady rhythm. There was a taste of terror burning at the back of his throat. There was an ethereal craze that was haunting him, bleeding into his skin and locking his muscles into a vice hold. There was no way to control it. Levi had no intention to. The only thing that mattered now was his wrath and his memory. "Look at me, damn it." A man with pale hair arched his neck back, his eyes sweeping the rooftop. The face was familiar, and Levi loathed it with every solitary fiber of his being. In a strange half a heartbeat, their eyes met. The gaze was held with the same seething tension as an arm being held above an open flame. The recoil was harsh and the burn was harsher. It ached and peeled and scarred until there was always a reminder of what happened when one treaded where they should not. Levi was the flame, and the man's had snapped back to attention, his eyes staring hollowly ahead of him. And yet the wings emblazoned on Owen Smith's back branded themselves into Levi's mind. "Levi," Mikasa said, grasping his hand. "What's wrong?" There was a strange sense of guilt there as his mind shoved his heart aside. He squeezed her fingers anyway. He needed the comfort for what he was about to do. "Mikasa," he said, his voice empty. "I'm so sorry," he wished he could say. There was a hollow place inside him, a hole with a monster twisting around it, guarding its empty secrets. The hatred he bore the bastard, who was now nothing but another green cloak in the parade of fools, was ineffable. His bones were tingling with apprehension and disgust. "I'm going to join the Survey Corps."